Chapter 1. The Desperate Mother. The rain struck the grimy windows of Spinner's End like accusations, each drop a reminder of everything Narcissa Malfoy had failed to prevent. She stood in the narrow street, her travelling cloak heavy with September dampness, watching the dim light that leaked from behind Severus Snape's curtains. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since her son had rolled up his sleeve and shown her the dark mark burned into his pale forearm. 3 weeks since she had watched 17 years of careful protection crumble into ash. Narcissa could have apparated directly to Snape's door, but she had walked the last mile through Cokeworth's industrial wasteland instead. The extra time let her think, let her rehearse the words she needed to say. More importantly, it let her check for followers. Lucius thought she was visiting her sister Andromeda, a lie that would hold for perhaps 6 hours before he grew suspicious. The other Death Eaters thought she was grieving in her garden, as any proper pure-blood wife should when her child was conscripted into war. None of them knew she was here, in this squalid Muggle neighborhood, preparing to ask questions that might get them all killed. The front door opened before she could knock. Severus stood in the doorway, his black robes making him appear like a shadow that had learned to stand upright. His dark eyes took in her appearance, the tremor in her hands, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, the desperate set of her mouth, and he stepped aside without a word. Narcissa. His voice was as flat as always, but she caught something underneath it that might have been sympathy. Or perhaps resignation. I was wondering when you would come. She followed him into the cramped sitting room, noting how he warded the door behind her with a flick of his wand. The house smelled of old books and brewing ingredients, with an underlying staleness that spoke of a man who rarely opened his windows to let in fresh air. It was exactly the sort of place where desperate conversations happened. Severus, She stopped, surprised by how her voice cracked on his name. Narcissa Malfoy didn't crack. She had been raised to maintain perfect composure, even while the world burned around her. But composure was a luxury she could no longer afford. My son is going to die. Snape settled into his worn armchair and gestured for her to take the sofa. His movements were precise, controlled, but she noticed the way his fingers drummed once against the chair's arm before he stilled them. Draco accepted the mark willingly. He knew the consequences. He accepted it because the alternative was watching his father tortured to death in our drawing room. The words came out harsher than she intended, sharp with 3 weeks of suppressed fury. Don't pretend this was a choice, Severus. We both know what the Dark Lord does to those who refuse him. For a moment, Snape said nothing. Then he leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. What exactly are you asking of me, Narcissa? This was the moment she had rehearsed during that long walk through the rain, the moment where she would beg for her son's life, where she would offer anything, gold, blood, her own life, in exchange for Draco's safety. But now, sitting in this dim room with rain pattering against the windows, a different question emerged. I want to know who we're really serving. Snape's eyebrows rose fractionally. It was the most emotion she had seen him display in years. I'm not certain I understand. The Dark Lord has given my son a task. She fought to keep her voice level, to sound like she was discussing a particularly challenging arithmancy equation rather than her child's death sentence. Kill Albus Dumbledore, a 17-year-old boy, barely out of school, ordered to murder the most powerful wizard alive. Tell me, Severus, does that strike you as a mission designed for success? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, a car drove past with its radio playing something cheerful and ordinary, a sound so disconnected from their conversation that it felt obscene. "The Dark Lord's strategies are not for us to question," Snape said finally. But there was something careful in his tone, something that suggested he had asked himself the same question. Narcissa leaned forward, her blue eyes fixed on his face. "I've spent 3 weeks thinking about this. 3 weeks watching my son try to hide his terror behind bravado. 3 weeks lying awake, wondering why the Dark Lord would waste a Malfoy heir on an impossible task. And do you know what conclusion I've reached?" Snape waited. "That Draco is not meant to succeed. He is meant to fail. The question is whether his failure serves the Dark Lord's purposes or someone else's." The words hung in the air like a curse. Narcissa watched Snape's face, looking for any sign that she had gone too far, that he was already reaching for his wand to report her treasonous thoughts to his master. Instead, she saw something that might have been relief flicker across his features. "You suspect Dumbledore," he said. "It wasn't a question. I suspect everyone." She smoothed her hands over her skirt, a gesture that had once been unconscious, but now felt like armor. "Tell me something, Severus. In all your years at Hogwarts, in all your observations of the great Albus Dumbledore, have you ever seen him make a decision that didn't ultimately serve his purposes?" Snape was quiet for so long that Narcissa began to wonder if he had decided not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to show me the truth." She met his gaze steadily, pouring every ounce of her aristocratic breeding into the words. "You've been watching, haven't you? All these years you've been in a position to see things others miss. The Dark Lord trusts you. Dumbledore trusts you. You've seen how both sides operate, how both sides treat the children caught in their web." Snape's fingers drummed against the chair arm again. "And if I have? Then show me." The request came out barely above a whisper. "I need to understand what kind of men we've been serving. I need to know what they've done to the children in their care. Because if I'm going to save my son, I need to know which monsters I'm fighting." For a moment, Narcissa thought he would refuse. Snape was nothing if not cautious, and what she was asking bordered on treason against both the Dark Lord and Dumbledore. But then he stood abruptly, his black robes billowing around him, as he moved to a cabinet she hadn't noticed before. "There are things," he said slowly, his back to her, as he opened the cabinet door, "that I have seen. Things I have been forced to participate in. Things I have preserved." He withdrew something that gleamed silver in the lamplight, a shallow stone basin covered with runes that seemed to shift and dance in the dim illumination. Narcissa recognized it immediately from her days at Hogwarts. "A pensive," she breathed. "My own," Snape confirmed, setting it carefully on the table between them. "Not Dumbledore's. He doesn't know it exists." He reached into the cabinet again and withdrew a collection of small crystal vials, each one containing what looked like silver smoke. "These are memories. My memories. Things I witnessed, conversations I overheard, decisions I was forced to enable." Narcissa stared at the vials, her heart hammering against her ribs. Each one represented a piece of truth, a glimpse behind the careful facades both sides maintained. Memories of what? Snape's dark eyes were unreadable as he met her gaze. Of what powerful men do to children when they think no one is watching. He uncorked one of the vials, and the silver memory swirled out to settle in the pensive like moonlight on still water. As Narcissa leaned forward to peer into the basin, she caught a glimpse of what lay within. A small figure on a doorstep, a baby left alone in the dark. "The night everything began," Snape said quietly. "The night Harry Potter was abandoned to his fate." Narcissa looked up at him, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "You've been watching him. All these years you've been collecting evidence." "I've been remembering," Snape corrected, "because someone needs to bear witness to what we've done, to what we've allowed to be done." He gestured toward the pensive. "Look, Narcissa. Look and see what Albus Dumbledore considers acceptable sacrifice." She hesitated for only a moment before leaning forward and letting herself fall into the swirling memory. The last thing she saw before the silver light consumed her was Snape's expression, haunted, guilty, and unutterably tired. The memory took her, and suddenly she was standing on a quiet suburban street, watching a tall man with a long silver beard place a sleeping infant on a doorstep, like a package left for collection. The baby stirred slightly in the cold November air, but the man didn't pause to comfort him, or even to ensure he was properly covered. He simply walked away, leaving Harry Potter to wake alone in the dark. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Was Left. The memory swirled around Narcissa like cold water, and suddenly she was standing on Privet Drive in the pre-dawn darkness of November 1st, 1981. The street was eerily quiet, lined with identical houses that seemed to hunker down against the autumn chill. She could see her breath in the air, could smell the lingering smoke from Guy Fawkes' preparations, though the holiday was still days away. 3 figures stood beneath a street lamp. Narcissa recognized them immediately. Albus Dumbledore in his flowing purple robes, Professor McGonagall in her emerald travelling cloak, and the half-giant Hagrid cradling a bundle that could only be Harry Potter. "Are you sure this is wise, Albus?" McGonagall's voice carried clearly through the still air, sharp with concern. "I've been watching them all day. The Dursleys are the worst sort of muggles imaginable. They spoil their own son rotten. But Harry—" She gestured toward the bundle in Hagrid's arms. "They hate everything that isn't perfectly ordinary. They'll never understand him." Dumbledore's response made Narcissa's blood run cold. "Perhaps that is for the best, Minerva. The boy will be far safer growing up away from all this." He gestured vaguely toward the magical world. "He will be protected from pride, from knowing too much too soon about his fame." "Protected from pride?" McGonagall's voice rose slightly. "Albus, these people will treat him terribly. I've watched them. The woman gossips viciously about her neighbors. The man shouts at children for walking too close to his car. They won't love Harry. They won't even like him." "He doesn't need to be liked," Dumbledore said gently, as if he were discussing the weather. "He needs to be humble. He needs to understand sacrifice. The blood protection Lily's sacrifice created will keep him safe from Voldemort. But it can only work if he calls Privet Drive home." However reluctantly. Narcissa watched in growing horror as Dumbledore took the sleeping infant from Hagrid and placed him on the cold doorstep like a package awaiting delivery. The baby stirred slightly in the November chill, his small fist emerging from the blankets, but Dumbledore didn't pause to ensure he was warm enough or properly positioned. "At least leave him a proper explanation," McGonagall pleaded. "A letter telling them how to care for him, what he'll need." "I have left a letter." Dumbledore's tone suggested the matter was closed. They will understand what is required of them. As the 3 magical figures disappeared into the night, leaving Harry Potter alone on the doorstep, Narcissa felt the memory begin to fade. But before it ended entirely, she caught sight of the letter tucked beneath the baby's blankets, a single piece of parchment that would somehow be expected to explain 15 years of guardianship to people who had never shown kindness to anyone. The Pensieve's silver surface rippled, and suddenly Narcissa was pulled into a different memory. This one took place on the same street, but in bright daylight. Harry Potter, now perhaps 4 years old, was kneeling in a meticulously maintained garden, pulling weeds under the watchful eye of a massive boy who could only be Dudley Dursley. "Faster, freak," Dudley commanded, his pudgy face already showing signs of the cruel satisfaction that would define him. "Mummy says if you don't finish before tea, you don't eat." Narcissa watched as the small boy, so thin his clothes hung on him like sails on a mast, worked frantically to clear the flower bed. His hands were dirty and scratched, and she could see him occasionally wince as thorns caught his fingers. When he finally finished, Dudley inspected his work with theatrical authority. "You missed a spot," Dudley declared, pointing to a perfectly clean section of soil. "Mummy, the freak's being lazy again." Petunia Dursley emerged from the house, her face already set in lines of disapproval. Without bothering to examine Harry's work, she grabbed his thin wrist and dragged him toward the house. "Ungrateful little beast, after everything we've done for you. No supper tonight, and you can think about what you've done in your cupboard." Narcissa's breath caught. Cupboard. The memory shifted again, and now she was inside the house on Privet Drive, watching as Harry, still only 4, was shoved into what appeared to be a storage space beneath the stairs. The boy curled up on a thin mattress that barely fit the cramped space, surrounded by old coats and cleaning supplies. A small shelf held a few broken toys and a single picture book with half the pages torn out. "Please," Harry whispered to the door as it clicked shut, the sound barely audible even in the memory's perfect clarity. "I'll be good. I promise, I'll be good." The memory dissolved, and Narcissa found herself back in Snape's sitting room, gasping as if she had been underwater. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel tears on her cheeks, though she didn't remember beginning to cry. "That was only the beginning," Snape said quietly. His voice seemed to come from very far away. "He lived in that cupboard until he was 11 years old." "A cupboard?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "They kept a child in a cupboard. The blood protection required that he live with Lily's relatives," Snape continued, his tone carefully neutral. "It did not require that they treat him with kindness. Dumbledore was quite clear about that distinction when I expressed concerns." Narcissa looked up sharply. "You tried to intervene?" "Once." Snape's expression was unreadable. "After I had been watching the house for several months and realized the extent of their treatment. I went to Dumbledore with what I had observed. Would you like to see his response?" Without waiting for her answer, he poured another memory into the pensieve. This one showed Dumbledore's office, clearly years earlier, based on the younger appearance of both men. Snape stood before the headmaster's desk, his face tight with controlled anger. "You knew," Memory Snape said accusingly. "You knew exactly what kind of people they were when you left him there." Dumbledore looked up from his paperwork with mild interest. "I knew they would not spoil him. Yes, that they would not fill his head with ideas about his own importance. The boy must grow up humble, Severus, prepared for the burdens he will one day bear." "Humble?" Snape's voice cracked slightly. "Albus, they're starving him. I've watched the boy go days without a proper meal. They lock him away like some shameful secret." "And yet he is alive," Dumbledore replied calmly. "He is protected. The alternative, allowing him to grow up knowing he is famous, beloved, the hero of the wizarding world, would be far more dangerous to his character development." "His character development?" Snape stepped closer to the desk, his hands clenched at his sides. "He's 7 years old. He should be learning to read, to play with other children, to feel safe in his own bed. Instead, he's learning that he's worthless, that love is something he has to earn and will never be given freely." Dumbledore's expression remained maddeningly serene. "Sometimes the kindest lessons are the most painful ones, my dear boy. Harry is learning resilience, humility, the value of simple kindness when it is finally offered to him. These experiences will serve him well when he faces the darkness ahead." The memory faded, leaving Narcissa staring at Snape across his dim sitting room. "You argued for him," she said wonderingly. "You tried to save him." "I tried." Snape's voice was bitter. "And I was told that my concern was noted but unnecessary, that Mrs. Figg was watching the situation and would report if intervention became truly necessary." Arabella Figg, the squib who lived nearby. "Indeed." Snape reached for another vial. "Would you like to see her reports to Dumbledore? The concerns she raised year after year, and how they were dismissed?" This memory showed an elderly woman with grey hair and multiple cats sitting in what was clearly Dumbledore's office. Her hands twisted in her lap as she spoke, her voice pleading. "Professor Dumbledore, I'm truly worried about young Harry. The boy hasn't grown an inch since last summer, and I can count his ribs when he helps me with my garden. Yesterday I saw him faint while mowing their lawn. Faint, Professor, from hunger and exhaustion." Dumbledore nodded sympathetically. "Your concern does you credit, Arabella. However, we must trust that his relatives know best how to discipline him. A little hardship builds character." "Character?" Mrs. Fig's voice rose. "So this isn't character building, this is cruelty. The boy apologizes for breathing too loudly. He thanks me for stale biscuits like I've given him the crown jewels. Children shouldn't be grateful for basic kindness. They should expect it. The boy is learning valuable lessons about the world, Arabella. Not all children are fortunate enough to understand struggle before they face real adversity. Harry will be stronger for these experiences." Mrs. Fig tried once more. "But surely there's some other family, some other way to keep him safe without ensuring he grows up properly prepared for his destiny." Dumbledore's voice carried a subtle note of finality. "I think not. Continue your observations by all means, but do not interfere with the Dursleys' methods. They are adequate." As the memory ended, Narcissa found herself on her feet, pacing to Snape's narrow window and staring out at the rain. Her entire body felt cold, as if she had absorbed the chill from that November night 15 years ago. "He knew," she said finally. "Every report, every concern. He knew exactly what was happening to that child, and he chose to let it continue." "More than that," Snape said quietly. "He engineered it. The blood protection could have been maintained with any number of safeguards, wards on a loving relative's home, protective charms, even adoption by a magical family with appropriate protections. But those options would not have produced the result Dumbledore wanted." Narcissa turned back to face him. "Which was? A boy who would do anything to earn love. A boy who would see sacrifice as noble rather than tragic. A boy who would walk willingly to his death if he thought it would save others." Snape's dark eyes met hers. "Tell me, Narcissa, if Harry Potter had grown up, loved and confident and secure, do you think he would be so eager to throw away his life for the greater good?" The question hung in the air like a curse. Narcissa thought of her own son, spoiled and protected and certain of his worth, and tried to imagine Draco accepting a suicide mission for any cause. The image wouldn't form. "There's more," Snape said, reaching for another vial. "Would you like to see what happened when Harry's accidental magic first manifested? How an 8-year-old child was punished for something he couldn't control or understand?" Narcissa nodded, though part of her wanted to refuse, wanted to flee back to her comfortable manor and pretend she had never seen any of this. But Draco was somewhere in Hogwarts tonight, carrying the weight of an impossible task, and she needed to understand exactly who had set the precedent for using children as weapons. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me everything." Chapter 3. The Convenient Orphan. The pensive pulled Narcissa into another memory, and suddenly she was standing in the immaculate sitting room of number 4, Privet Drive. The house was exactly as sterile and unwelcoming as she had imagined. Beige walls, beige furniture, and family photographs that featured only 3 people. Harry Potter, perhaps 7 years old now, sat hunched in the corner on a hard wooden chair, his thin frame nearly swallowed by clothes that were clearly hand-me-downs from his much larger cousin. Albus Dumbledore sat across from Vernon and Petunia Dursley, his purple robes vibrant against their muted decor. He looked perfectly comfortable, as if he were visiting old friends rather than confronting people who clearly despised both him and the child in their care. "Professor Dumbledore," Vernon's voice was tight with barely controlled hostility. "I thought we had an understanding. You people were supposed to leave us alone." "Indeed, Mr. Dursley, and I have no intention of disrupting your household routine." Dumbledore's tone was infuriatingly pleasant. "I merely wish to check on young Harry's progress, to ensure he is developing appropriately." Narcissa watched as Harry flinched at being mentioned, his green eyes darting between the adults like a trapped animal, trying to determine which direction danger might come from. The boy's face was gaunt, his wrists thin enough that Narcissa could probably have circled them with her thumb and forefinger. "He's developing fine," Petunia said sharply. "We've done exactly what you asked. Kept him fed, clothed, and out of trouble. We don't coddle him like some families might." "Excellent." Dumbledore turned his attention to Harry for the first time since entering the room. "And how are you finding life with your aunt and uncle, my boy?" Harry's response was barely a whisper. "Fine, sir. They're very good to me." Narcissa could see the lie in every line of the child's body, the way he kept his hands folded tightly in his lap, the careful distance he maintained from everyone else in the room, the practiced blankness of his expression. This was a child who had learned that the truth was dangerous, that survival depended on telling adults what they wanted to hear. Dumbledore, who was supposedly the most powerful wizard alive, who could certainly see through the pretense of a 7-year-old, simply nodded approvingly. "I'm pleased to hear it. Now, Harry, I wonder if you might go to your room while I speak with your guardians about some rather dull adult matters." Harry practically fled from the room, his relief at being dismissed palpable. Once his footsteps faded up the stairs, Vernon leaned forward aggressively. "Look here, Dumbledore. We've kept up our end of the bargain, but the boy's getting stranger by the day. Last week, he somehow got on the school roof when he was being chased by Dudley's friends. Yesterday, Petunia's roses grew 3 feet overnight after he walked past them, crying. We can't keep covering for these incidents." "Ah, yes. His magical development is proceeding normally, then." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled, as if this were delightful news. "I trust you're handling these manifestations with appropriate discipline?" "Of course we are," Petunia snapped. "He's been told that freakish behavior won't be tolerated in this house. We won't have him thinking he's special." "Quite right. It's crucial that Harry understands his magic is something to be controlled, contained, something that sets him apart in ways that are burdensome rather than advantageous." Dumbledore paused, studying the Dursleys with apparent approval. "I take it he knows nothing of his heritage? His parents? His fame in our world?" "Nothing," Vernon confirmed with satisfaction. "As far as he knows, his parents died in a car crash because they were drunken layabouts. He thinks he's lucky we took him in at all." "Perfect." Dumbledore's smile was warm, grandfatherly. "It's so important that he approach his magical education with proper humility. A child who believes himself special often becomes difficult to guide." The memory began to fade, and Narcissa found herself back in Snape's sitting room, her hands clenched so tightly her nails were cutting into her palms. "He approved," she said, her voice hollow. He saw that child, thin, terrified, lying to protect himself, and he approved. "Dumbledore has always been quite clear about the importance of shaping Harry's character," Snape said dryly. "Would you like to see how he orchestrated the boy's introduction to the magical world?" Without waiting for an answer, he poured another memory into the pensive. This one showed the familiar interior of the Hog's Head, where Dumbledore sat across from Hagrid in a private booth. The half-giant looked uncomfortable, his massive hands wrapped around a tankard of ale. "Professor, I don't understand why it has to be so dramatic," Hagrid was saying. "Surely the boy could just get his letter like any other Hogwarts student. Maybe have someone explain things to him properly?" "Ah, but Harry is not like any other student, Hagrid." Dumbledore's voice carried that familiar note of gentle certainty. "He has been deliberately kept ignorant of his heritage. Rightfully so, I might add. When he learns the truth, it must have maximum emotional impact. The contrast between his current life and the world that awaits him must be stark. But the Dursleys will try to stop him from coming to Hogwarts. They hate magic. Indeed they will. And when you arrive to collect him, Harry will see you as his savior. He will associate the magical world with rescue, with escape from misery. This emotional connection will serve him well in the years to come. Dumbledore leaned forward slightly. It is crucial, however, that you reveal only certain aspects of his history. Hagrid frowned. What do you mean? Tell him about his fame, by all means. Let him understand that he is beloved by our world. But do not mention the Potter family vault at Gringotts. Do not tell him about the properties he has inherited, the investments, the social connections that come with his name. Let him believe that Hogwarts is his only home, that the magical world's affection is his only inheritance. But, Professor, the boy is entitled to know— The boy is entitled to nothing that might make him independent, Dumbledore interrupted, his tone still gentle but carrying an edge of steel. Hagrid, you must understand that Harry's financial situation could greatly complicate his education. A wealthy young man might be tempted to make his own choices about his future. An orphan dependent on Hogwarts charity will be far more grateful for guidance. Narcissa watched Hagrid's face as he processed this instruction. The half-giant clearly wasn't comfortable with the deception, but his loyalty to Dumbledore won out over his moral qualms. If you think it's best, Professor. I do indeed. And Hagrid, when you take Harry to Diagon Alley, I want you to ensure he understands the full magnitude of his fame. Let him hear the whispers, see the bows, feel the weight of expectation. But also make sure he understands how different he is from other children his age. Emphasize his ignorance, his need to learn, his dependence on others for knowledge about his own world. The memory shifted, and now Narcissa was witnessing a private conversation in Dumbledore's office. Snape stood before the headmaster's desk, looking younger and somehow more uncertain than she was used to seeing him. You want me to place the Philosopher's Stone in the school, Snape said slowly, while Harry Potter is a student there. I want you to help create protections for the stone that an exceptionally clever first year might be able to overcome, Dumbledore corrected gently. With sufficient motivation and assistance, of course. Snape's expression was carefully blank. You want Potter to reach the stone. I want Harry to face a test commensurate with his abilities and circumstances. The boy has lived his entire life being told he is worthless, ordinary, a burden. He needs to experience genuine danger, genuine consequence, so that he might discover his own courage. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled behind his half-moon spectacles. Besides, Voldemort will certainly attempt to retrieve the stone. Better that Harry encounter him in a controlled environment where help can be provided if necessary. Controlled environment? Snape's voice rose slightly. Albus, you're talking about deliberately exposing an 11-year-old to mortal peril. I'm talking about education, my dear Severus. Harry must learn that the magical world is dangerous, that his choices have consequences, that heroism requires genuine sacrifice. These lessons cannot be taught in a classroom. Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming distant. The boy will face Voldemort eventually. That much is certain. Better that he do so with some experience of what that entails. And if he dies in this educational experience? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Then, that would be unfortunate, but it would also mean he was not capable of fulfilling his ultimate purpose. Better to learn that sooner rather than later, when the stakes are even higher. The memory dissolved, leaving Narcissa staring at Snape in horror. He placed the stone at Hogwarts specifically so Harry would have to face Voldemort, she said slowly. An 11-year-old child. The first of many such tests, Snape confirmed, each one escalating in danger, each one designed to push Harry further into the role Dumbledore had chosen for him. Role? Narcissa felt something cold settling in her stomach. What role? Snape hesitated, then reached for another vial. Perhaps it would be better to show you. This memory took place in the same office, but clearly years later. Snape looked more like the man Narcissa knew now, and his expression was grim as he faced Dumbledore across the desk. "You've been planning this from the beginning," Snape accused. "Every adventure, every crisis, every near-death experience, you've orchestrated all of it." "I've provided opportunities for growth," Dumbledore replied mildly. "Harry has made his own choices about how to respond to those opportunities." "Opportunities?" Snape's voice was incredulous. "You call deliberately placing children in mortal danger an opportunity? The stone, the basilisk, the tournament. How many times must he nearly die before you consider his education complete?" "Harry is not an ordinary child, Severus. He cannot be educated through ordinary means." Dumbledore's tone carried a note of finality. "Every trial he faces teaches him something essential about courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to accept loss for the greater good. These are not lessons that can be learned from books. And what happens when he finally learns too much? When he realizes that every crisis in his life has been deliberately arranged? When he understands that he's been manipulated since birth?" Dumbledore's smile was infinitely sad. "By then, my dear boy, it will no longer matter. By then, Harry will be ready to do what must be done." The pensive went still, its surface reflecting Narcissa's pale face as she stared down into its depths. The silence in Snape's sitting room was complete, except for the steady patter of rain against the windows. "Ready to do what?" she asked finally, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "To die," Snape said simply. "Everything. The abuse, the manipulation, the orchestrated crises, the careful isolation from anyone who might truly care for him. All of it has been designed to create a boy who will walk willingly to his own execution when the time comes." Narcissa thought of her own son, spoiled and beloved and absolutely certain that the world owed him comfort and safety. She thought of how Lucius had raged when Draco was given his impossible mission, how her husband had immediately begun seeking ways to protect their child from consequence. Then she thought of Harry Potter, raised to expect nothing, to believe he deserved nothing, to see his own death as a reasonable price for others' safety. "How many others know?" she whispered. "About the larger plan. Very few, but they all know enough to play their parts." Snape's expression was bitter. "We are all complicit, Narcissa. Every adult who has failed to question why a child keeps facing mortal danger. Every teacher who has failed to truly protect him. Every person who has seen his suffering and chosen to look away because Dumbledore assured them it was necessary." Narcissa stood abruptly, pacing to the window again. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the dark street, and she found herself thinking about her own comfortable manor, her own safe life, her own willingness to trust that powerful men knew what was best. "Show me more," she said, her voice stronger now. "Show me everything. If I'm going to save my son from becoming another convenient sacrifice, I need to understand exactly how these men operate." Behind her, she heard Snape uncorking another vial. "Very well," he said quietly, "but be warned. It gets worse before it gets better." Chapter 4. The Professor's Burden. The next memory pulled Narcissa into Dumbledore's office on what appeared to be a late autumn evening in 1981. She could tell immediately that this was shortly after Voldemort's fall. There was a celebratory quality to the very air, magic itself seeming lighter somehow. Severus Snape stood before Dumbledore's desk, but he was not the composed, controlled man Narcissa knew. This younger Snape was hollow-eyed with grief, his hands shaking as he gripped the back of a chair. "She's dead," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Lily is dead, and I helped kill her. You could not have known what information would lead to, my boy." Dumbledore's voice was gentle, but there was something calculating in his expression as he studied Snape's broken state. "And now you have a chance to honor her memory." "Honor her memory?" Snape's voice cracked. "How can I possibly? By protecting her son." The words hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Snape straightened slightly, his black eyes fixing on Dumbledore with desperate intensity. "The boy lives?" "Indeed. Harry Potter is alive, though he will grow up far from our world for his own protection." Dumbledore leaned forward, his voice taking on that familiar tone of gentle persuasion. "I have a position available at Hogwarts, Severus. Potions Master. It would allow you to be here when Harry arrives, to watch over him as Lily would have wanted." "Yes," Snape breathed. "Yes, anything. I'll do anything to protect him." "I'm very pleased to hear that." Dumbledore's smile was warm, grandfatherly. "However, I must caution you that protecting Harry will require certain sacrifices on your part. You must maintain your cover as a reformed Death Eater. The other side must never suspect that you have turned against them completely." Snape nodded eagerly. "I understand. I'll be careful." "More than careful, I'm afraid." Dumbledore's tone became serious. "Should Voldemort return, and I believe he will, he must see you as a valuable asset. This means you cannot appear to favor Harry in any way. Indeed, you must seem to dislike him." The memory Snape's face went pale. "You want me to mistreat Lily's son? I want you to ensure that when Voldemort inevitably searches your thoughts, he sees only a professor who treats Harry Potter with the appropriate level of disdain for James Potter's offspring." Dumbledore's voice remained gentle, as if he were asking Snape to water his plants rather than abuse a child. "It will be difficult, I know, but it is the only way to keep you close enough to truly protect him." Narcissa watched as Snape struggled with this impossible instruction. The man's love for Lily Potter was written across every line of his face, and the idea of harming her son was clearly torture for him. "There must be another way," Snape said desperately. "Surely I can protect him without maintaining your cover, without preserving your position of trust on both sides?" Dumbledore shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid not, my dear boy. The protection Harry needs most is not kindness in a classroom. It is having someone positioned to save his life when the time comes. And that someone can only be you." The memory began to fade, but not before Narcissa saw Snape's shoulders slump in defeat, his head bowing as he accepted the burden that would define the next 15 years of his life. The pensive swirled, and suddenly Narcissa was standing in the Hogwarts potions dungeon on what could only be Harry's first day of classes. The room was filled with first years, their faces bright with curiosity and nervousness. And there, in the back row, sat Harry Potter, 11 years old, undersized even for his age, wearing robes that clearly didn't fit properly. Snape swept into the classroom like a bat, his black robes billowing behind him. But Narcissa could see what the students couldn't, the way his eyes immediately found Harry and lingered there, the almost imperceptible pause as he took in the boy's appearance. Harry looked so much like James Potter that it was startling. The same unruly black hair, the same general build, even the same way of sitting with unconscious confidence. But when Harry raised his head, when those bright green eyes met Snape's across the classroom, Narcissa saw the professor's composure crack for just an instant. Lily's eyes. Exactly, perfectly Lily's eyes, looking out from James Potter's face. "Potter," Snape said, his voice cutting through the classroom chatter like a blade. "Our new celebrity." Narcissa could see the war being fought behind Snape's expression, the desperate desire to protect Lily's child warring with the need to maintain his cover, to appear appropriately hostile. When he spoke again, his words were cruel, but she could see the pain each one cost him. "Tell me, Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry's confused silence was answer enough. The boy had been raised by Muggles, knew nothing of the magical world, and Snape knew this perfectly well. But he pressed on with his calculated humiliation, each question designed to expose Harry's ignorance before his classmates. Clearly, fame isn't everything, Snape concluded with satisfaction that Narcissa now knew was entirely fabricated. For your information, Potter, Asphodel, and Wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the Draught of the Living Death. The irony of the first question was not lost on Narcissa. In the language of flowers, Asphodel meant regret, Wormwood meant absence, and bitter sorrow. Even in his cruelty, Snape had been trying to communicate something: regret for Lily's death, sorrow at her absence, the bitter reality of his position. The memory shifted forward in time, showing Snape alone in his office late that same evening. The man sat hunched over his desk, his head in his hands, looking like he had aged years in a single day. "Forgive me, Lily," he whispered to the empty room. "Forgive me for what I have to do to him." Another memory took its place, this one showing a private conversation between Snape and Dumbledore in the headmaster's office. It was clearly early in Harry's first year, based on Snape's haggard appearance and the tension in his bearing. "You want me to increase the hostility," Snape said, his voice carefully controlled, "to make my dislike of him more obvious." "I'm afraid so, my dear Severus. There have been whispers among certain circles about your behavior toward Harry. Some wonder if you might be developing a soft spot for the boy." Dumbledore's tone was apologetic, but firm. "We cannot afford such speculation." "I see." Snape's hands clenched at his sides. "And how exactly would you like me to demonstrate this increased hostility?" "Nothing dramatic, of course. Simply ensure that your treatment of him is consistent with what Voldemort would expect from someone who despised James Potter's memory." Dumbledore paused, studying Snape's face. "Perhaps Doc points from Gryffindor more frequently when he makes mistakes. Show favoritism to other houses when he is present. Make it clear that his fame means nothing to you." Narcissa watched as Snape's jaw tightened. "You're asking me to psychologically torment a child?" "I'm asking you to save his life," Dumbledore replied gently. "When Voldemort returns, he will test your loyalty by examining your thoughts. What he sees there regarding Harry Potter could mean the difference between life and death, for both of you." The memory faded, replaced by one that clearly took place after the Philosopher's Stone incident in Harry's first year. Snape sat in his private chambers, a half-empty bottle of fire whiskey on the table beside him. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his hands shaking as he poured another drink. "He almost died," Snape said to the empty room, his voice slurred with alcohol and grief. 11 years old, and he almost died because I wasn't there. Because I was too busy playing my role, maintaining my cover." He took another drink, then continued speaking to the air as if Lily Potter might be listening. "You should see him, Lily. He's so small, so thin. The Muggles haven't fed him properly. I can see his ribs through his robes. And those eyes, God, those eyes. Every time he looks at me, it's like you're asking why I'm hurting him." Snape's voice broke completely. "I don't know how much more of this I can bear. Watching him struggle, watching him hurt, and knowing that I'm part of what's hurting him. Dumbledore says it's necessary, that I have to maintain the illusion. But sometimes I think he's forgotten that Harry is just a child." The memory showed Snape sitting in silence for a long time, staring at nothing. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I'll keep protecting him, Lily. Even if he never knows, even if he hates me for the rest of his life. I'll keep him safe. But I don't know how much longer I can pretend that it doesn't destroy me every time I have to be cruel to him." The pensive went still, its surface reflecting Narcissa's shocked face. She found herself back in Snape's sitting room, staring at the man who had just revealed the most painful aspects of his double life. The rain continued to patter against the windows, but the sound seemed muffled now, as if the world itself were holding its breath. "Severus," she said softly, her voice thick with unexpected emotion. "I had no idea. All these years, I thought. We all thought you truly despised the boy." "As I was meant to." Snape's expression was carefully controlled, but she could see echoes of that younger man's pain in his dark eyes. The performance had to be convincing, not just for Voldemort, but for everyone. The other teachers, the students, even Harry himself. The moment anyone suspected that I cared for him, his life would have been in even greater danger. Narcissa thought of all the times she had heard Lucius speak approvingly of Snape's treatment of Potter, all the occasions when Death Eaters had praised his obvious disdain for the boy who lived. None of them had seen the truth, that every cruel word, every unfair punishment, every public humiliation had been a knife in Snape's heart. "The boy doesn't know," she said. It wasn't a question. "Harry knows only what he was meant to know, that I am a bitter, vindictive man who takes pleasure in tormenting him because he reminds me of his father." Snape's voice was steady, but she could hear the weight of years beneath it. "It has to remain that way. Even now? Even when Voldemort has returned and your position is secured?" Snape was quiet for a long moment. "Especially now. Voldemort tests my loyalty regularly through legilimency. Every memory of Harry must show appropriate hostility, appropriate disdain. The moment he sees even a flicker of genuine care." Snape didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Narcissa stood and moved to the window again, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. All these years, she had seen Snape as Dumbledore's loyal lieutenant, a man who had chosen his side and found peace in that choice. She had never imagined the daily torture of his position, the constant sacrifice required to maintain his cover. "How do you bear it?" she asked finally. "Because the alternative is worse," Snape replied simply. "Harry Potter must live to fulfill his destiny, whatever that may be. And I am the only one positioned to ensure that happens. Everything else, my reputation, my peace of mind, even my relationship with him, is secondary to that goal." Narcissa turned back to face him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "You love him." "I love what remains of Lily in him," Snape corrected quietly. "And I am determined to ensure that what remains of her in this world is protected, even if I must destroy myself to do it." The admission hung between them, like a bridge suddenly built across an impossible chasm. Narcissa thought of her own son, of the lengths she would go to protect Draco, and realized that Snape had been traveling that same desperate path for 15 years. "Show me more," she said, her voice stronger now. "Show me what Dumbledore has asked you to do since Voldemort returned. Show me what other prices you've been forced to pay for the privilege of protecting Lily's son." Snape nodded and reached for another vial. "Very well. But know this, Narcissa. What you've seen so far is only the beginning. The true horror of Dumbledore's plans has yet to be revealed." Chapter 5. The Chamber of Secrets. The next memory swept Narcissa into Dumbledore's office during what was clearly a faculty meeting in the autumn of 1992. She could see the tension in every teacher's face. Professor McGonagall sat rigidly upright. Professor Flitwick wrung his hands nervously, and even the normally jovial Professor Sprout looked grim. At the head of the table, Dumbledore appeared serene, despite the crisis that had clearly gripped the school. "3 students petrified," McGonagall said sharply. 3 children turned to stone by some monster loose in the school, and we're no closer to finding it than we were when Mrs. Norris was attacked. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened before," Dumbledore said calmly, his fingers steepled before him. "In 1943, a student died. Now it has been opened again, and we must remain vigilant while we investigate." "Vigilant?" Professor Sprout's voice rose slightly. "Albus, children are being attacked in our school. Shouldn't we be evacuating them? Closing Hogwarts until we can be certain of their safety?" Narcissa watched as Dumbledore's expression grew thoughtful, but not in the way of a man considering the safety of children. Instead, he looked like someone calculating odds, weighing potential gains against acceptable losses. "That would be premature," he said finally. "The attacks, while concerning, have not been fatal. The students can be cured once we locate the proper ingredients for Mandrake Draught, and there is much we might learn by observing how this situation develops." "Learn?" McGonagall's voice was incredulous. "Albus, what could possibly be worth risking students' lives to learn?" "The identity of the person controlling the creature, for one thing," Dumbledore replied mildly. "This is clearly not a random attack. Someone has opened the chamber deliberately, and I suspect their motives go far beyond simple malice." Snape, who had been silent until now, leaned forward slightly. "You have suspicions about who might be responsible?" "Indeed I do." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "But confirming those suspicions will require patience. We must allow events to unfold naturally." "Naturally?" Professor Flitwick squeaked. "Albus, if you know who's responsible, I suspect Phileas. I do not know, and the difference is crucial." Dumbledore's tone became gentle, but firm. "We must be very careful not to act precipitously. Sometimes the most valuable information comes from observing how a crisis resolves itself." The memory shifted, and suddenly Narcissa was in Snape's private office late at night. The potions master sat across from Dumbledore, his expression carefully controlled, but his hands clenched in his lap. "You know it's Potter," Snape said without preamble. "You know Harry will try to solve this himself." "I suspect he will become involved, yes." Dumbledore's tone was maddeningly calm. "Harry has a particular talent for finding himself at the center of such mysteries." "A talent you've deliberately cultivated," Snape accused, "just as you cultivated his involvement with the Philosopher's Stone. You want him to face whatever creature is in the chamber." "I want Harry to have opportunities to grow, to test his abilities under pressure." Dumbledore's expression grew distant. "The boy will face far worse than a basilisk before his story is complete. Better that he learn to handle such challenges now, while the stakes are still manageable." Narcissa felt her blood run cold. Manageable stakes? Students were being petrified, lives were hanging in the balance, and Dumbledore considered this manageable? "And if he dies?" Snape's voice was tight with controlled fury. "If your 12-year-old test subject doesn't survive his encounter with a 1,000-year-old monster?" "That would be unfortunate," Dumbledore said, echoing his earlier comment about the Philosopher's Stone. "But it would also confirm that Harry is not capable of fulfilling his ultimate purpose. The sooner we learn that, the sooner we can make alternative arrangements." "Alternative arrangements?" Snape's voice cracked slightly. "You speak of Lily's son as if he's a piece on a chessboard." "Are we not all pieces on someone's board, Severus?" Dumbledore's smile was infinitely sad. "The difference is that I am trying to ensure Harry becomes a piece that can matter in the final game." The memory dissolved, replaced by one that showed the Great Hall during the height of the chamber crisis. Students sat in tense clusters, whispering fearfully amongst themselves. Teachers patrolled the aisles, their wands at the ready. In the middle of it all sat Harry Potter, looking impossibly young and isolated, despite being surrounded by his classmates. Narcissa could see Dumbledore at the head table, his eyes fixed on Harry with calculating interest. When the boy stood abruptly and hurried from the hall, the headmaster made no move to follow or send a teacher to check on him. Instead, he simply continued watching the doorway where Harry had disappeared, his expression thoughtful. "He's going to investigate," came Snape's voice from behind her. Narcissa turned to see him standing in the shadows near the staff table, his dark eyes also fixed on the exit. "Yes," Dumbledore murmured, barely loud enough for Snape to hear. "And when he does, we shall finally have our answers." The memory shifted again, this time to Dumbledore's office during what appeared to be a conversation with the ministry official Cornelius Fudge. The two men sat across from each other, Fudge looking harried and nervous, while Dumbledore appeared serenely unconcerned. "The Board of Governors is demanding action, Dumbledore," Fudge said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. 4 students petrified now, parents pulling their children from school. They want someone to blame. And they have chosen me, I presume? They want your removal as headmaster, Fudge confirmed reluctantly. Just temporarily, you understand, until this crisis is resolved. Dumbledore nodded, as if this were perfectly reasonable. I see. And when exactly will this removal take effect? Tomorrow morning. I'm sorry, Albus, but my hands are tied. What struck Narcissa as most disturbing was not Fudge's nervousness, but Dumbledore's complete lack of concern. The man seemed almost pleased by this development, as if being removed from the school was exactly what he had wanted. Of course, Dumbledore said gently. I quite understand. Though I do hope the situation resolves itself quickly. It would be such a shame if any students were seriously harmed while I am absent. The way he said it made it clear that he expected students to be seriously harmed, and that his absence would somehow be crucial to how events unfolded. Another memory took its place, this one showing a private moment in what appeared to be the Chamber of Secrets itself. Harry Potter, tiny and blooded, knelt beside an unconscious Ginny Weasley, while a magnificent red bird, Fawkes, perched nearby. The boy looked no older than Draco had when he first started showing accidental magic, yet here he was, alone in a deadly chamber with a girl who was clearly dying. But what made Narcissa's stomach turn was the realization that this was a memory from Dumbledore's perspective. The headmaster had arrived in the chamber not to rescue the children, but to observe the aftermath of Harry's confrontation with Tom Riddle and the basilisk. Remarkable, Dumbledore murmured, his voice filled with scientific interest rather than concern for the injured children. Quite remarkable indeed. Harry looked up at him with desperate relief. Professor Dumbledore, Ginny, she's barely breathing. Tom Riddle made her do it. He was controlling her through the diary. Yes, I suspected as much, Dumbledore said calmly, making no immediate move to help the dying girl. Instead, he studied the destroyed diary with fascination. A piece of Voldemort's soul, preserved in an object. Ingenious, really. Professor, please. Harry's voice broke with exhaustion and fear. Ginny needs help. Only then did Dumbledore turn his attention to the unconscious girl, and even then his examination seemed more clinical than concerned. She will recover, he pronounced finally. The connection has been severed, though the trauma of this experience will serve as a valuable lesson about trusting mysterious magical objects. Narcissa wanted to scream. A child had nearly died, and Dumbledore was treating it like a learning exercise. The memory faded, returning her to Snape's sitting room. She found herself gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. He let it happen, she whispered. All of it. The attacks, the terror, children being petrified. He let it all happen so he could observe how Harry would respond. Worse than that, Snape said grimly. He orchestrated it. Do you think it was coincidence that Gilderoy Lockhart was hired as defense teacher that year? A man so incompetent he was guaranteed to be useless when students needed protection. You're saying Dumbledore hired Lockhart deliberately? I'm saying Dumbledore knew exactly what kind of man Lockhart was when he offered him the position. Snape reached for another memory vial. Would you like to see that conversation? The memory showed Dumbledore's office during what was clearly a job interview. Gilderoy Lockhart sat across from the headmaster, his perfectly styled hair gleaming in the lamplight, his smile as bright and empty as a shop window. I must confess, Professor Dumbledore, I'm surprised you're considering me for the position, Lockhart was saying. I mean, naturally I'm qualified. My books have sold millions of copies. But I understand the defense position has been somewhat cursed in recent years. Indeed it has, Dumbledore agreed pleasantly. Which is why I need someone who won't be too concerned with actually teaching the subject. Lockhart's smile faltered slightly. I'm sorry? The students will need to learn to rely on their own resourcefulness this year, Dumbledore explained, his tone still gentle and grandfatherly. A truly competent defense teacher might interfere with that process. What I need is someone who will look impressive in the role while remaining fundamentally ineffective when any real danger arises. Lockhart's expression grew calculating. And what exactly do you expect to happen this year that would require such ineffectiveness? Oh, I suspect there will be various challenges. Nothing that capable students can't handle on their own, of course. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled. Though it will be important that they be forced to handle these challenges without adequate adult supervision or guidance. I see. Lockhart's smile returned, even brighter than before. And my compensation for this specialized approach to teaching? Quite generous, I assure you. Plus, of course, the publicity value of teaching at Hogwarts. I imagine your book sales will increase substantially. As the memory ended, Narcissa stared at Snape in horror. He hired an incompetent fraud, specifically, so the children would be unprotected. Dumbledore has always been very thorough in his planning, Snape said dryly. Every variable accounted for, every potential interference eliminated, including competent adults who might actually protect the children he wants to test. Narcissa thought of Ginny Weasley, 11 years old, possessed by a piece of Voldemort's soul, nearly dying while Dumbledore watched with clinical interest. She thought of all the other students who had been petrified, their parents sick with worry, while their headmaster used their children's suffering as a learning exercise. How many times? She asked quietly. How many times has he put children in danger for his greater good? Every year, Snape replied without hesitation. Every single year since Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts, there has been some crisis, some danger, some test that puts students at risk. And every time, Dumbledore has found a way to ensure that Harry faces it with minimal adult support. Narcissa stood abruptly and paced to the window, her mind racing. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the dark street, each drop seeming to echo her growing horror. She thought of Draco, safe in his bed at Malfoy Manor, protected by wealth and status, and parents who would move heaven and earth to keep him from harm. Then she thought of Harry Potter, raised to expect nothing, trained to sacrifice everything, systematically isolated from anyone who might truly protect him from the manipulations of powerful men. "Show me more," she said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "Show me what other children he's been willing to sacrifice for his plans." Behind her, she heard Snape uncorking another vial. "The Triwizard Tournament," he said grimly, where Dumbledore allowed a 14-year-old boy to be entered in a competition designed to kill adult wizards, because it served his purposes to have Harry delivered directly to Voldemort. Narcissa turned back to face him, her blue eyes blazing. "Show me everything." Chapter 6. The Triwizard Trap. The memory that pulled Narcissa in next was perhaps the most chilling yet, taking place in Dumbledore's office just days before the start of the 1994 school term. A man she recognized as Alastair Mad-Eye Moody sat across from Dumbledore, but something about his posture, his mannerisms, seemed subtly wrong. His magical eye spun constantly, but his real eye held an intensity that didn't quite match the gruff aura's usual demeanor. "The Triwizard Tournament will provide excellent cover," the false Moody was saying, his voice carrying the growling tone she remembered. 3 dangerous tasks, each one potentially fatal. If Potter dies during one of them, it will appear to be a tragic accident. Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Barty. Though I must say, your impersonation of Olastor is quite convincing. Even I might be fooled if I didn't know better." Narcissa's blood froze. Dumbledore knew. He had known from the very beginning that Mad-Eye Moody was an imposter, that Barty Crouch Jr. had infiltrated the school. "You're certain Potter's name will emerge from the goblet?" the false Moody continued. Oh yes, quite certain. A fourth school will be entered into the competition at the last moment, with Harry as its sole champion. The magic of the goblet will compel him to compete, regardless of his age or qualifications. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled with that familiar, terrible satisfaction. The beauty of it is that everyone will assume his entry was the result of some student prank or ambitious plotting. No one will suspect that it was deliberately arranged. And you're comfortable allowing him to face tasks designed to kill adult wizards. The tasks will test him appropriately, Dumbledore replied calmly. Harry has shown remarkable resilience in his previous encounters with mortal danger. I have confidence he will survive long enough to reach the final task, where the real test awaits. Narcissa watched in growing horror as the two men discussed the tournament like a chess game. With 14-year-old Harry Potter as a piece, they were maneuvering toward some predetermined position. The other champions? Barty asked. Unfortunate, but necessary for authenticity. Though I confess, young Diggory's participation does add a certain emotional weight to the proceedings. Harry will feel responsible for any harm that comes to his schoolmate. The casual mention of Cedric Diggory made Narcissa's stomach turn. They were discussing not just Harry's endangerment, but the calculated risk to other students who would be caught in their web of manipulation. The memory shifted to Halloween night, 1994, in the Great Hall, as the Goblet of Fire spat out its selections. Narcissa watched as Harry's name emerged from the blue flames, seeing the genuine shock on the boy's face, the confusion and growing dread as he realized what was happening. But more revealing was Dumbledore's reaction, while everyone else in the hall showed varying degrees of surprise, confusion, or outrage. The headmaster's expression showed only mild concern for public consumption. Behind his half-moon spectacles, his eyes held the satisfaction of a plan unfolding exactly as intended. "Harry Potter!" Dumbledore called out, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence. "Come forward, please." Narcissa could see the calculated nature of every word, every gesture. Dumbledore was performing for the crowd, playing the role of the concerned headmaster, while inwardly celebrating another successful manipulation. Another memory took its place, this one showing a private conversation in Snape's office shortly after the first task. The potions master sat across from Dumbledore, his expression carefully controlled, but his hands clenched in his lap. "He nearly died," Snape said without preamble. "That dragon almost killed him, and the only reason he survived was luck and the intervention of that ridiculous fake Moody." "But he did survive," Dumbledore pointed out gently. "And more importantly, he learned valuable lessons about thinking on his feet under extreme pressure." "Extreme pressure?" Snape's voice rose slightly. "Albus, you had a 14-year-old boy face a Hungarian horntail with no preparation, no training, no adequate protection. That wasn't a lesson. It was attempted murder. The boy had his wand, his magic, and his natural instincts. Sometimes the best education comes from being forced to rely on those fundamental resources." Dumbledore's tone remained maddeningly calm. Besides, Barty was there to ensure things didn't go too far wrong. "Barty Crouch Jr.," Snape said flatly. "The Death Eater you've allowed to impersonate an aura and infiltrate the school. The man whose primary loyalty is to the Dark Lord, not to Harry's welfare." "Young Barty's motivations are more complex than they appear," Dumbledore replied with that infuriating twinkle in his eyes. "His orders from Voldemort require Harry to survive until the final task. In this case, his dark allegiance serves our purposes quite well." Narcissa felt sick. Dumbledore was not just allowing a Death Eater to endanger students, he was counting on that Death Eater's conflicting loyalties to provide Harry with just enough protection to survive, but not enough to escape the larger trap. The memory dissolved, replaced by one that took place after the second task. Harry sat in the hospital wing, recovering from his ordeal in the Black Lake, while Dumbledore questioned him about his experience. "Tell me about the song the Mer people sang," Dumbledore said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp with interest. What exactly did they tell you about the hostages? They said we'd have an hour to find what we'd sorely miss, Harry replied, still looking exhausted and shaken. That after an hour, our treasures would be gone forever. And you believed them? Harry nodded. I couldn't leave them down there. Hermione and Ron and that little girl. I couldn't just take Ron and leave the others to die. Dumbledore's expression grew thoughtful. Even when taking additional time to save the other hostages, put your own life at greater risk. Of course, Harry said, as if there could be no other answer. They were innocent people. I couldn't just abandon them. As the memory ended, Narcissa realized what Dumbledore had been testing. Not Harry's magical ability or his courage, but his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. Every task had been designed to measure how far the boy would go, how much he would risk, to protect innocent lives. He was training him, she whispered to herself, training him to choose others' lives over his own. The next memory showed the most horrifying conversation yet, taking place in Dumbledore's office just hours after Harry's return from the graveyard, where Cedric Diggory had died. Harry was clearly in shock, traumatized by what he had witnessed, but Dumbledore's first concern was not the boy's welfare. Tell me everything, Dumbledore said, his voice gentle but insistent. Every detail of what Voldemort did, every ritual component, every word spoken. Harry, still shaking with grief and trauma, recounted the horrible night, Cedric's death, his own blood being used in Voldemort's resurrection, the confrontation with the returned Dark Lord. Throughout his telling, Dumbledore listened with clinical interest, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. The connection between your wands, Dumbledore said when Harry finished. Tell me more about that phenomenon. Professor, Harry said, his voice breaking, Cedric is dead. Voldemort is back. Shouldn't we be telling people? Shouldn't we be warning them? All in good time, Harry. But first, I need to understand the magical implications of what occurred. Dumbledore's tone was maddeningly patient. This connection between you and Voldemort, it may prove to be invaluable in the conflicts to come. Narcissa watched in disgust as Dumbledore treated Harry's traumatic experience as a source of useful intelligence, showing more interest in the magical mechanics of what had happened than in the boy's obvious need for comfort and support. The memory shifted to show Snape entering the office later that same night, finding Dumbledore alone at his desk, making notes with evident satisfaction. Cedric Diggory is dead, Snape said without preamble. A 17-year-old boy, killed because you needed Harry Potter delivered to the Dark Lord. Young Diggory's death is indeed tragic, Dumbledore replied, not looking up from his notes. But it was not entirely unforeseen. The final task always carried the greatest risk. Unforeseen? Snape's voice was incredulous. You knew Crouch was going to turn the cup into a portkey. You knew it would transport Harry directly to Voldemort. You could have prevented Diggory's death with a single word. I could have, Dumbledore agreed calmly. But doing so would have meant losing a crucial opportunity. Voldemort's resurrection was inevitable. Better that it happen under circumstances that provide us with maximum intelligence and minimum strategic advantage to him. And Diggory? What about his life, his future, his family who will grieve for him? Dumbledore finally looked up, his expression growing distant. War requires difficult choices, Severus. Sometimes good people die so that more good people might live. Cedric's death, while regrettable, serves a greater purpose. Which is? Harry now understands, viscerally and completely, what Voldemort is capable of. He has seen innocent death up close, has felt the weight of responsibility for someone else's fate. These experiences will serve him well when he faces similar choices in the future. Dumbledore's tone grew almost fond. The boy's guilt over Cedric's death will motivate him to fight harder, sacrifice more willingly, when the time comes. The memory faded, leaving Narcissa back in Snape's sitting room, trembling with rage. She stood abruptly and began pacing, her hands clenched into fists. "He killed that boy," she said, her voice shaking. "He might not have cast the curse, but he arranged every circumstance that led to Cedric Diggory's death. And he did it to traumatize Harry Potter into being more willing to sacrifice himself. Cedric was what Dumbledore would call an acceptable loss," Snape said grimly. "One life weighed against the greater good of ensuring Harry would be properly motivated for his ultimate destiny." His destiny? Narcissa whirled to face him. What destiny could possibly justify murdering innocent children? Snape hesitated, then reached for another vial with shaking hands. "Perhaps it's time you saw the full scope of Dumbledore's plans. The reason behind every manipulation, every cruelty, every calculated sacrifice." "Show me," Narcissa said, her voice deadly calm. "Show me exactly what Albus Dumbledore considers important enough to build on a foundation of children's corpses." "Very well," Snape said quietly. "But know this. After you see this next memory, there will be no going back. No comfortable ignorance, no ability to pretend that we serve anyone other than a man who views children as expendable resources." Narcissa thought of Draco, asleep in his bed at Hogwarts, carrying the weight of an impossible mission. She thought of Harry Potter, traumatized and manipulated since birth, being shaped into a weapon through systematic abuse and calculated loss. "I'm already past the point of no return," she said firmly. "Show me everything." Behind her, she heard Snape uncork the vial that would reveal Dumbledore's ultimate plan for the boy who lived. Chapter 7. The Order's Pawn. The next memory swept Narcissa into the gloomy kitchen of Grimmauld Place during the summer of 1995. The Order of the Phoenix sat around the long table, their faces grave as they discussed their strategy for the war that was now undeniably upon them. At the head of the table sat Dumbledore, serene and commanding despite the crisis that had gripped the wizarding world. "Harry must be kept in complete ignorance," Dumbledore was saying, his tone gentle but absolutely firm. "No information about our activities, our plans, or our discoveries. Nothing that might encourage him to take independent action." "But Albus," Molly Weasley protested, her voice tight with concern. "The boy has been through so much. Surely he deserves to understand what's happening. He was there when Voldemort returned. He has a right to know." "Harry has many rights," Dumbledore agreed calmly. "But knowledge is not among them. Not yet. The boy must learn to trust others to act on his behalf, to accept that there are burdens he cannot and should not carry alone." Narcissa watched as several Order members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even among Dumbledore's closest allies, there was clearly unease about keeping a traumatized teenager completely isolated from information about the war he was central to. "What if he tries to seek information on his own?" Kingsley Shacklebolt asked carefully. "The boy is resourceful. If he feels we're lying to him, then we must ensure he understands the consequences of such actions," Dumbledore replied. "Harry's greatest weakness has always been his conviction that he must face everything alone. We must teach him that this approach leads only to disaster." Sirius Black leaned forward, his face etched with concern. "Albus, keeping him locked away at the Dursleys all summer, then bringing him here, but refusing to tell him anything. You're treating him like a prisoner. The boy is 15 years old, not 5. And that is precisely why these measures are necessary," Dumbledore said, his eyes twinkling with that familiar, terrible satisfaction. "A 5-year-old accepts restrictions without question. A 15-year-old chafes against them, grows frustrated, makes increasingly desperate attempts to regain some measure of control over his circumstances." The memory shifted, showing a private conversation between Dumbledore and Snape in the headmaster's office several months later. Snow was falling outside the windows, suggesting this took place during the winter term of Harry's 5th year. "The boy's occlumency lessons are progressing poorly," Snape reported, his voice carefully neutral. He seems unable to clear his mind, to create the necessary barriers against the Dark Lord's intrusions. I see. Dumbledore's tone suggested this was exactly what he had expected to hear. And your teaching methods? Are they sufficiently challenging? Snape's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You want me to ensure he fails? I want you to ensure he learns that success requires proper motivation, Dumbledore corrected gently. Harry has always been most effective when driven by urgent necessity rather than abstract instruction. Perhaps a more experiential approach to learning would serve him better. You want me to deliberately sabotage his training? Snape's voice was flat, but Narcissa could hear the horror beneath his careful control. To leave him vulnerable to the Dark Lord's mental intrusions. I want you to ensure that when Harry inevitably encounters Voldemort's thoughts, he will be properly motivated to act on what he sees. Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The boy's heroic instincts are admirable, but they need direction. Narcissa felt her stomach drop as she understood what Dumbledore was planning. He wasn't trying to protect Harry from Voldemort's mental manipulations. He was ensuring Harry would be vulnerable to them, would see whatever Voldemort wanted him to see. The memory dissolved, replaced by one that took place in the same office, but clearly much later in the year. Snape stood before Dumbledore's desk, his face pale, with barely contained fury. He saw Black being tortured, Snape said without preamble. The vision came during our lesson, exactly as you predicted it would. Potter is convinced his godfather is dying in the Department of Mysteries. And how did Harry react to this vision? Dumbledore's tone was mild, as if they were discussing the weather, rather than a teenager's psychological torment. As you expected. He's desperate to mount a rescue mission. He tried to use the Flu Network to contact Black at Grimmauld Place, but I intercepted the call as instructed. Excellent. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. And you maintained the deception? Convinced him that Sirius was indeed at the Ministry? Snape nodded stiffly. I told him Black was not at Grimmauld Place, which was technically true since you had me send him on that reconnaissance mission to the continent. Potter drew his own conclusions about where his godfather must be. Perfect. And I trust you made no effort to dissuade him from his planned rescue attempt? I followed your instructions to the letter, Snape said, his voice tight with self-loathing. I allowed him to believe that Black was in mortal danger, and that only he could save him. I even ensured his detention with Umbridge would end early enough for him to act on his convictions. Narcissa stared at the memory in growing horror. Dumbledore had orchestrated every element of Harry's psychological manipulation, the failed occlumency lessons that left him vulnerable, the convenient absence of Sirius from Grimmauld Place, even the timing of Harry's detention to ensure he would have the opportunity to rush into Voldemort's trap. And the other students? Dumbledore inquired. I trust Harry won't be facing this challenge alone? Potter convinced several of his friends to accompany him, Snape confirmed. Granger, Weasley, Lovegood, Longbottom, and the younger Weasley girl. All of them are convinced they're mounting a rescue mission. 6 children, Dumbledore murmured, as if savouring the number. Excellent. The experience will be far more educational if Harry feels responsible for his friend's safety, as well as his godfather's. The memory shifted to show the aftermath of the Department of Mysteries battle. Harry sat in Dumbledore's office, his face streaked with tears, his body shaking with grief and shock. Sirius Black was dead, killed during the confrontation that had been orchestrated from the very beginning. It's my fault, Harry whispered, his voice broken. If I hadn't rushed in, if I hadn't believed the vision, Sirius would still be alive. Indeed, Dumbledore said gently, making no effort to contradict Harry's self-blame. Your actions had consequences, Harry. This is a lesson many young people must learn, though rarely at such a terrible cost. Narcissa wanted to scream. The man was using Sirius's death as a teaching moment, allowing a traumatized 15-year-old to carry the guilt for a death that had been orchestrated by Dumbledore himself. "What should I have done differently?" Harry asked desperately, looking to Dumbledore for some guidance that might help him make sense of his guilt. "You should have trusted your elders," Dumbledore replied. "You should have understood that there are adults in your life who are better equipped to handle dangerous situations, who have more experience with the complexities of war." "But the Order wasn't doing anything to save him," Harry protested. "If I hadn't acted, Sirius would have died anyway." "Perhaps, or perhaps not." Dumbledore's tone remained infuriatingly calm. "We will never know now, will we? The point is that your decision to act independently, to trust your own judgment over that of your elders, led directly to tragedy." The memory faded, replaced by a conversation between Dumbledore and Snape that took place immediately after Harry had left the office. Snape stood rigid before the headmaster's desk, his hands clenched at his sides. "You let him blame himself," Snape accused. "Black is dead because of your manipulations, and you're allowing Potter to believe it's his fault." "Harry's guilt is a necessary burden," Dumbledore replied serenely. "It will motivate him to be more careful in the future, more willing to sacrifice his own desires for the safety of others." "More willing to die when you ask him to," Snape said flatly. "More willing to understand that sometimes death is the price of protecting those we love," Dumbledore corrected. "Sirius died protecting Harry and his friends. The boy must learn to see such sacrifice as noble rather than tragic. And if he doesn't learn that lesson, if he chooses to withdraw, to protect himself and others by staying away from the conflict?" Dumbledore's smile was infinitely sad. "Then we will provide additional educational opportunities until he does." The memory ended, leaving Narcissa back in Snape's sitting room, her hands shaking with rage. The rain outside had intensified, hammering against the windows like bullets, but she barely noticed the sound over the roaring in her ears. "He killed Sirius Black," she said, her voice hollow with shock. "He orchestrated every element of that disaster just to traumatize Harry into being more obedient." "Sirius was becoming a problem," Snape said grimly. "He was growing too close to Harry, providing too much emotional support, asking too many questions about Dumbledore's plans. His death served multiple purposes." Narcissa thought about the isolation tactics she had just witnessed, keeping Harry in the dark, cutting him off from information, allowing him to feel helpless and desperate until he was willing to take any action, however reckless, just to feel some measure of control. Then she thought about Draco, alone at Hogwarts, carrying the weight of an impossible mission with no one to confide in, no adults who could provide real help or guidance. "He's doing the same thing to my son," she realized, her voice barely above a whisper. The isolation, the impossible task, the constant threat hanging over our family. Draco is being manipulated in exactly the same way. "The Dark Lord learned many of his techniques from Dumbledore," Snape confirmed. "The systematic isolation, the use of guilt and fear as motivational tools, the careful orchestration of crises that force the victim to act against their own interests." Narcissa stood abruptly and began pacing again, her mind racing as she connected the patterns she had seen in the memories to her own family's situation. "Voldemort wants Draco to fail," she said, understanding flooding through her. Just like Dumbledore wanted Harry to suffer. The impossible mission, the lack of support, the threat to our entire family if he doesn't succeed. It's all designed to break him down, to make him desperate enough to take increasingly dangerous risks. And when he inevitably fails, Snape added quietly, his failure will serve Voldemort's larger purposes, just as Harry's suffering has served Dumbledore's. The realization hit Narcissa like a physical blow. Both sides, the supposed forces of light and the acknowledged forces of darkness, were using the same tactics, manipulating children through systematic psychological torture to achieve their strategic goals. "There has to be another way," she said firmly, turning to face Snape with newfound determination. "Some path that doesn't require sacrificing our children on the altar of powerful men's ambitions." "Perhaps," Snape said carefully, "but it would require us to oppose both sides simultaneously, to reject both Dumbledore's greater good and Voldemort's pure blood supremacy in favor of something else entirely." And what would that something else be? Snape was quiet for a moment, then reached for the final vial of memories. "Perhaps it's time you saw Dumbledore's ultimate plan for Harry Potter, the true purpose behind all the suffering, all the manipulation, all the calculated losses. Only then can you decide whether there's any alternative worth pursuing." Narcissa looked at the vial in his hands, knowing that whatever it contained would be worse than anything she had seen before. But she also thought of Draco, trapped in the same web of manipulation that had ensnared Harry Potter, and knew she had no choice but to see this through to the end. "Show me," she said. "Show me what Albus Dumbledore considers worth the price he's extracted in children's blood." Chapter 8. The Horcrux Revelation. The final memory that Snape poured into the pensive was different from the others. The silver strands that swirled into the basin seemed darker somehow, heavier with the weight of terrible knowledge. As Narcissa leaned forward to peer into its depths, she could see that this memory was more recent than the others. It took place in Dumbledore's office, but the headmaster looked older, more frail than he had in previous memories. The memory pulled her in, and suddenly she was standing behind Snape as he faced Dumbledore across the familiar desk. But this was not the composed potions master she knew. This Snape was shaking with barely contained emotion, his face pale with shock. "You're telling me," Snape said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "that Harry Potter is a Horcrux." "Indeed," Dumbledore replied calmly, as if they were discussing a particularly interesting transfiguration problem. "When Voldemort attempted to kill Harry as an infant, a piece of his soul broke away and attached itself to the only living thing present, the boy." "A piece of Voldemort's soul," Snape repeated, the words seeming to stick in his throat. "Living inside Harry Potter for 15 years. 16 now, actually," Dumbledore corrected gently. "And yes, that fragment of Tom's soul has been residing within Harry all this time. It's what gives the boy his ability to speak to serpents, his connection to Voldemort's thoughts and emotions." Narcissa watched as Snape sank into the chair across from Dumbledore's desk, as if his legs could no longer support him. "How long have you known?" "I began to suspect after Harry's first year," Dumbledore admitted. "The incident with the basilisk, his ability to hear the voice in the walls, these were not normal manifestations of magic. My suspicions were confirmed when Voldemort returned, and I observed the strength of the connection between them." 2 years, Snape said flatly. "You've known for 2 years that Harry Potter carries a piece of the Dark Lord's soul, and you said nothing." "I said nothing because the knowledge would have served no useful purpose," Dumbledore replied. "Indeed, it might have interfered with Harry's development in ways that could prove catastrophic." "His development?" Snape's voice cracked. "Albus, if the boy is a Horcrux, then he's keeping Voldemort anchored to life. As long as Harry lives, the Dark Lord cannot be truly defeated." "Precisely." Dumbledore's eyes held that familiar, terrible twinkle. "Which brings us to the crux of the matter, doesn't it?" The silence that followed was so complete that Narcissa could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. When Snape finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "You're going to kill him." "I am going to ensure that Harry understands his destiny," Dumbledore corrected gently. "The boy must die, Severus. There is no other way to destroy the Horcrux without destroying Voldemort's anchor to immortality. But that death must be willingly chosen, or it will not achieve the desired result." Willingly chosen. Snape lurched to his feet, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "You're asking a 16-year-old boy to commit suicide. I am asking a young man who has been carefully prepared for this moment to make the ultimate sacrifice for the greater good," Dumbledore replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. "Everything in Harry's life has been designed to lead him to this choice, Severus. The isolation, the suffering, the constant reinforcement that other people's lives matter more than his own, all of it has been preparation for this moment." Narcissa felt the world tilt around her as the full scope of Dumbledore's plan became clear. Every memory she had witnessed, every instance of manipulation and cruelty, every calculated trauma, all of it had been designed to create a boy who would walk willingly to his own execution. "The Dursleys," Snape said, his voice hollow with understanding. "You left him with them specifically, so he would grow up believing he was worthless." Harry needed to understand that his life had no intrinsic value beyond what he could provide to others, Dumbledore confirmed. A boy raised with love and confidence would never accept that his death was necessary. A boy raised to believe himself a burden, however, would see his own death as a gift to those he cares about, Snape finished, horror and disgust warring in his expression. "Precisely." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with his protégé's understanding. "Every trial Harry has faced, every loss he has suffered, every moment of self-doubt and guilt, all of it has been carefully calibrated to produce a young man who will see self-sacrifice as noble rather than tragic." The memory shifted slightly, showing the conversation from a different angle, and Narcissa could see tears streaming down Snape's face. The man was weeping openly now, his composure completely shattered. "Lily's son," he whispered. "You've spent 16 years turning Lily's son into a sacrificial lamb. I have spent 16 years ensuring that Lily's sacrifice will not be wasted," Dumbledore replied firmly. "She died to save Harry's life. Now Harry will complete her work by giving that life to save everyone else." "He's a child," Snape's voice broke completely. "He's just a child, and you've been planning his murder since he was 11 years old." "I have been planning the salvation of the wizarding world," Dumbledore corrected, his voice taking on a rare edge of steel. "One life weighed against thousands, one death to prevent countless others. Surely even you can see the arithmetic, Severus." "The arithmetic?" Snape's laugh was bitter and broken. "Is that how you sleep at night? By reducing a boy's life to arithmetic?" "I sleep at night knowing that I have made the hard choices others cannot," Dumbledore replied. "Someone must bear the burden of seeing the larger picture, of understanding what sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." The memory shifted forward in time, showing what appeared to be the same conversation several hours later. Snape sat slumped in his chair, looking as though he had aged a decade in the course of a single evening. "When?" he asked quietly. "Soon," Dumbledore replied. "Voldemort grows stronger daily, and his Horcruxes make him effectively immortal. We must begin preparing Harry for his final choice." "How?" The word came out as barely a whisper, gently, gradually. "We will continue to place him in situations where self-sacrifice appears to be the only honorable option. We will surround him with people whose safety depends on his willingness to give his life for theirs. And when the moment comes, we will ensure that Harry understands exactly what is at stake. And if he refuses? If he chooses to live rather than die for your greater good?" Dumbledore's expression grew infinitely sad. "Then we will provide him with additional motivation until he makes the correct choice. There are many people Harry cares about: Severus, his friends, his surrogate family members, the students he feels responsible for protecting. I trust his heroic nature will compel him to act appropriately when their lives hang in the balance. You'll threaten the people he loves, Snape said flatly. You'll use his friends as hostages to force him into suicide. I prefer to think of it as ensuring Harry has all the information he needs to make an informed decision, Dumbledore replied. But yes, if necessary, we will make it clear that his death is the only way to save those he cherishes most. The memory began to fade, but not before Narcissa heard Dumbledore's final, chilling words. The beauty of it is that Harry will thank us for the opportunity. By the time we're finished preparing him, he will see his own death as the greatest gift he can give to a world that has never truly valued him. The pensive went still, its surface reflecting Narcissa's white, shocked face. She found herself back in Snape's sitting room, but the familiar space felt alien now, as if she were seeing it through the eyes of someone who had just discovered that everything she thought she knew about the world was a lie. "He raised him to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the windows. Every moment of Harry's life, every kindness withheld, every trauma inflicted, it was all to create a boy who would willingly walk to his own execution. "And the most damning part," Snape said quietly, "is that it's working. Harry Potter believes, with every fiber of his being, that other people's lives matter more than his own. When the time comes, and it will come soon, he will choose death because 16 years of systematic abuse have convinced him that it's the right thing to do." Narcissa thought of Harry Potter as she had seen him in the memories, thin, isolated, desperately grateful for any scrap of kindness, always ready to sacrifice himself for others. Then she thought of her own son, and a terrible understanding began to dawn. "Draco," she breathed. "They're doing the same thing to Draco." "Not exactly the same," Snape said carefully. "Your son is not a Horcrux, and his death would serve different purposes. But the methodology is identical. Isolation, impossible expectations, the systematic destruction of any support system that might give him the confidence to refuse their demands. Voldemort wants Draco to die attempting his mission," Narcissa realized, the pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. "And if Draco somehow succeeds in killing Dumbledore, then Voldemort will have him killed anyway for being a security risk. Either way, my son dies, and his death serves to terrorize other families into complete obedience." "The Dark Lord learned many techniques from his old headmaster," Snape confirmed grimly, "including the art of using children's deaths to motivate their parents." Narcissa stood abruptly, her entire body trembling with a fury so pure it felt like ice in her veins. Outside, the storm had intensified, lightning illuminating the narrow street in stark, white flashes. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the hurricane building inside her chest. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of thunder. "No, I will not allow this. I will not stand by and watch while powerful men sacrifice our children on the altar of their ambitions." "Narcissa," Snape said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" She turned to face him, and he took an involuntary step back at the expression on her face. This was not the composed, pure-blood wife who had arrived at his door hours earlier. This was a mother who had seen the true face of the men who claimed to be protecting her child. "I'm proposing that we stop playing their game," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Both of them, Dumbledore and Voldemort, they need us to believe that we have no choice, that we must choose between their competing versions of horror. But there is another option." "Which is?" "We choose our children," she said simply. "We choose to protect them from both sides. We choose to say that no cause, however noble or however dark, is worth the sacrifice of innocent lives." Snape studied her face for a long moment. "That path leads to being hunted by both sides, to being branded traitors by everyone we've ever known." Then so be it. Narcissa's voice was steady, resolved. I would rather be a traitor to their causes than a participant in the murder of children. She moved to the window and stared out at the storm, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. Tomorrow I return to the manor. Tomorrow I begin planning how to save my son from the trap that has been set for him. And if possible, I will save Harry Potter as well. The boy doesn't know about the Horcrux, Snape warned. Dumbledore plans to tell him only when it's time for him to die. Then perhaps it's time someone else told him first, Narcissa said quietly. Someone who wants him to live, instead of die. She turned back to face Snape, her blue eyes blazing with determination. Will you help me, Severus? Will you help me find a way to save them both? For a long moment, Snape said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. For Lily, he said quietly, and for all the children these men would sacrifice for their greater good. For our children, Narcissa agreed, and for the chance to prove that love is stronger than any cause that demands their deaths. Chapter 9. The Malfoy Trap. The silence that followed the final memory stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss. Narcissa stood at the window, watching the storm rage outside, while behind her, Snape carefully corked the empty vial and returned it to his cabinet. The pensieve sat between them on the table, its surface still and silver, reflecting nothing now but the lamplight. 3 weeks, Narcissa said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks since my son rolled up his sleeve and showed me the dark mark burned into his skin. 3 weeks since I watched 17 years of protection crumble into nothing. She turned from the window, her eyes finding Snape's across the dim room. At the time, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to our family. I thought the Dark Lord's mark was the greatest threat my child would ever face. And now? Snape asked quietly. Now I understand that the mark was never the real danger, she replied, moving back to her chair but not sitting down. The real danger is what they're both trying to turn him into, another Harry Potter. Another child so broken by impossible expectations and systematic isolation that he'll accept death as preferable to disappointing the adults who control his fate. Narcissa began to pace, her movements sharp with controlled energy. Tell me about Draco's mission. Tell me exactly what the Dark Lord has asked of my son. To kill Dumbledore, Snape said simply. To infiltrate Hogwarts, gain access to the headmaster, and murder the most powerful wizard alive. All while maintaining his cover as a student, avoiding detection by the Order, and ensuring that his failure doesn't implicate other Death Eaters. An impossible task. Deliberately so, Snape confirmed, just as Harry's challenges were deliberately designed to push him beyond his capabilities. The Dark Lord learned from Dumbledore's example. If you want to break a child's will, you give him a task he cannot possibly complete, then make his family's safety dependent on his success. Narcissa stopped pacing and fixed Snape with a penetrating stare. You said Draco's task was to kill Dumbledore. But we both know Dumbledore is dying already. You've seen the curse damage on his hand. How long does he have? Months at most, Snape admitted. Perhaps less. The curse is spreading despite all my efforts to contain it. Then Draco's mission was never about actually killing Dumbledore, Narcissa realized, her voice growing cold with understanding. It's about the attempt, about forcing a 17-year-old boy to try to commit murder, knowing he will likely die in the process. Or be captured and sent to Azkaban, which might be worse, Snape agreed grimly. Either outcome serves the Dark Lord's purposes. If Draco succeeds through some miracle, Dumbledore dies. If he fails, the Malfoy family is destroyed as an example to others, and Draco becomes another traumatized child soldier, completely dependent on Voldemort for purpose and identity. Narcissa felt that familiar, ice-cold fury building in her chest again. The same pattern. Create an impossible situation, isolate the child from any real support, then use their inevitable failure to justify even greater control over their life. With one crucial difference, Snape said carefully. Harry was raised to see his own death as noble sacrifice. Draco was raised to expect privilege and protection. The Dark Lord's challenge now is to break down those expectations quickly enough to achieve the desired result. Which is why Lucius was imprisoned, Narcissa said, the pieces falling into place. Why our assets have been frozen. Why other Death Eater families have been instructed to shun us. The Dark Lord isn't just punishing us for Lucius's failure. He's systematically removing every source of comfort and security from Draco's life. Leaving him alone at Hogwarts, surrounded by enemies, with only an impossible mission to define his worth, Snape finished. It's remarkably similar to Harry's situation in his 5th year. Isolated, desperate, forced to rely on his own increasingly poor judgment, because all the adults in his life have failed him. Narcissa thought of her son as she had last seen him. Thin, pale, jumping at shadows, the boyish arrogance that had once defined him, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like the desperate gratitude she had seen in Harry Potter's eyes. Both boys, she realized, were being systematically taught that their lives had value only in service to causes that would ultimately destroy them. There's something else, she said slowly, working through the implications. Dumbledore knows about Draco's mission, doesn't he? He must know that a Death Eater's son has been sent to kill him. Of course he knows, Snape confirmed. I reported it to him immediately after you and Bellatrix left Spinner's End with the unbreakable vow. And his response? Snape hesitated. He was pleased. He said it provided an excellent opportunity for Harry to learn about the complexities of moral choice. Narcissa stared at him in horror. He's going to use Draco as another test for Harry Potter, another situation where Harry will be forced to choose between saving an enemy's child or protecting himself. Very likely, Snape agreed grimly. Dumbledore sees potential learning experiences everywhere. A Death Eater's son attempting murder, a hero who must choose between vengeance and mercy. It's precisely the sort of moral complexity he believes Harry needs to experience before his final confrontation with Voldemort. So both sides see my son as expendable, Narcissa said, her voice deadly quiet. Voldemort wants him to die attempting an impossible mission, and Dumbledore wants him to serve as a moral lesson for his precious chosen one. She moved to Snape's bookshelf and gripped the edge of it, her knuckles white with strain. Tell me about the unbreakable vow. Tell me exactly what I promised. That you would protect Draco to the best of your ability, Snape recited. That you would help him complete his mission if he faltered, and that you would take over the task yourself if he proved unable to complete it. And your counter-vow? To watch over Draco during his time at Hogwarts, to protect him from harm, and to complete the mission myself if necessary. Snape's voice was carefully controlled. The Dark Lord was very specific about the wording. He wanted to ensure that Dumbledore would die, regardless of Draco's success or failure. Narcissa turned back to face him, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's why you agreed to the vow. Not just to help me, but because you knew Dumbledore was dying anyway. You could fulfill the letter of the vow without actually betraying anyone. I thought I was being clever, Snape admitted. I thought I could save Draco while still serving Dumbledore's larger purpose. But now, having seen what you've shown me tonight, having understood the full scope of both men's manipulations, now you realize that there is no way to serve both masters without betraying the children caught between them, Narcissa finished, Dumbledore and Voldemort both want to use Draco's mission for their own ends, and neither of them cares whether he survives the experience. She began pacing again, her mind racing through possibilities and complications. We need to find a third option, a way to fulfill the letter of the vow while protecting Draco from both sides' machinations. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we take control of the narrative, Narcissa said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Both Dumbledore and Voldemort are counting on us to follow the scripts they've written. They expect us to react predictably, to serve their needs while believing we're protecting our children. She stopped in front of Snape's chair and leaned forward, her blue eyes blazing with determination. But what if we write our own script? What if we find a way to fulfill Draco's mission while simultaneously exposing the truth about what both sides have been doing to the children in their care? That would be extraordinarily dangerous, Snape warned. If either side suspects we're working against them. Then we make sure they don't suspect, Narcissa replied firmly. We continue to play our assigned roles while quietly building a foundation for something different, something that puts the children's welfare ahead of political objectives. Snape studied her face for a long moment. You're talking about more than just saving Draco. You're talking about challenging the fundamental assumptions that allow men like Dumbledore and Voldemort to treat children as weapons. I'm talking about refusing to accept that children must die for adult ambitions, Narcissa said simply. Harry Potter, Draco Malfoy, Ginny Weasley, Neville Longbottom, all of them have been put in mortal danger by adults who claim to care about their welfare while using them as pawns in larger games. She moved to the window again, staring out at the storm. You asked me once if I had ever seen Dumbledore make a decision that didn't ultimately serve his purposes. Tonight, I've seen that every decision he's made regarding Harry Potter has served the single purpose of preparing that boy to die willingly for the greater good. And Voldemort has learned from Dumbledore's example. He's using the same techniques to break down other children, to create a generation of young people so traumatized and isolated that they'll accept any authority figure who offers them purpose and belonging. Narcissa turned back to Snape, her expression resolute. I won't let them do to Draco what they've done to Harry, and if possible, I'll try to save Harry as well. The boy doesn't know about the Horcrux, Snape reminded her, and Dumbledore will not tell him until the moment comes for him to sacrifice himself. Then perhaps someone else should tell him first, Narcissa said quietly. Someone who wants him to live rather than die. Someone who can offer him alternatives to the choice Dumbledore has prepared for him. She moved back to her chair and sat down, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had found her purpose. I need to understand exactly how Dumbledore's plans are supposed to unfold. What is the timeline? When does he expect Harry to learn the truth? When does he expect the final confrontation to occur? Soon, Snape said grimly. Dumbledore's time is limited, and he wants to ensure Harry is fully prepared before his own death. I believe he intends for this school year to be Harry's last, one way or another. Which means we have at most 9 months to find alternatives to the paths both sides have laid out, Narcissa calculated. 9 months to protect both boys while building a foundation for something better. She looked at Snape with newfound respect and determination. You've carried the burden of protecting Harry Potter alone for 15 years, all while maintaining a facade that must have been torture for you. I'm asking you to help me shoulder that burden now, and to extend it to include my son as well. For Lily, Snape said quietly, echoing his earlier words, and for the chance to prove that love can be stronger than any ideology that demands children's deaths. For our children, Narcissa agreed, and for the possibility that we might yet find a way to save them both without sacrificing either to the ambitions of men who see them only as means to an end. Outside, the storm was beginning to calm, the thunder growing more distant. But inside Snape's modest sitting room, 2 adults who had spent years serving powerful masters were quietly planning a revolution built on the simple, radical idea that children's lives mattered more than the causes that would consume them. It was, they both knew, the most dangerous thing they had ever attempted, but it was also the most necessary. Chapter 10. The Mother's Choice. The storm outside had finally begun to calm, but inside Snape's sitting room, Narcissa Malfoy was just beginning to gather momentum. She stood before the rain-streaked window, no longer seeing the shabby street beyond, but envisioning possibilities that stretched far beyond this single night, this single conversation, this single choice between predetermined paths. "I need parchment," she said suddenly, turning from the window with the decisive energy of someone who had moved past contemplation into action. "And a quill. There are letters to write." Snape raised an eyebrow but moved to his desk, withdrawing the requested materials. "Letters to whom?" "To the other mothers," Narcissa replied, settling at the small table and pulling the parchment toward her. "To every woman who has watched powerful men place her children in danger and been told it was necessary for the greater good." She paused, quill hovering over the blank parchment, then looked up at Snape with sudden intensity. "Tell me about Molly Weasley. What kind of woman is she when her children are threatened?" "Fierce beyond measure," Snape replied immediately. "I watched her kill Bellatrix Lestrange in single combat when your sister threatened her daughter. Molly Weasley becomes absolutely deadly when she believes her children are in danger. And yet she allows them to fight in this war. She permits the Order to use her home as headquarters, knowing it puts her family at risk." Narcissa frowned, trying to understand the contradiction. "Why?" "Because she believes in Dumbledore's cause," Snape said carefully. "Because she thinks the war is necessary to protect the world her children will inherit. Because she has been convinced that the only choice is between supporting the Order or surrendering to Voldemort." "The same false choice they've offered all of us," Narcissa murmured, beginning to write. "Support one side's version of child sacrifice or accept the other's. But what if we offered her a third option? What if we showed her that it's possible to protect children without feeding them to either cause?" She wrote quickly, her elegant script flowing across the parchment. "Mrs. Weasley, you do not know me well, but we share something more important than blood or politics. We are both mothers who have watched this war consume the childhoods of those we love most. I write to you because I believe there may be another path forward, one that puts our children's welfare above the ambitions of the men who would use them as weapons. If you are willing to listen, I propose a meeting. Not as representatives of opposing sides, but as women who refuse to accept that our sons and daughters must die for causes they did not choose. The choice of time and place is yours. I ask only that you come with an open mind and a mother's heart. Narcissa Malfoy." She set the quill down and looked at Snape. "How do I get this to her without it being intercepted by either side?" "Carefully," Snape said grimly. "Both the Order and the Death Eaters monitor correspondence. You'll need a method that bypasses the usual channels." "My sister Andromeda," Narcissa said suddenly. "She's been cast out by the family for marrying a Muggle-born, but she's still my sister. And her daughter is an Auror, which means she has connections to people on both sides without being fully trusted by either." She pulled another piece of parchment toward her and began writing again. "Andromeda, 25 years have passed since I last wrote to you. 25 years since our family's madness drove us apart. I write now because I need the help of the sister I remember, the one who chose love over ideology, who refused to let pure blood supremacy define her worth. I believe we both have daughters and sons caught in this war through no choice of their own. I believe we both know what it means to watch powerful men play games with children's lives. And I believe we both remember what it felt like when our mother sacrificed family bonds on the altar of political purity. I am reaching out to other mothers who might be willing to consider alternatives to the paths our supposed leaders have set before us. If you are interested in protecting the next generation from the sins of the current one, please respond. Your sister, Narcissa. As she finished the second letter, Snape moved to pour himself another drink. You realize what you're proposing is tantamount to treason against both sides? I'm proposing that we stop treating treason against corrupt causes as if it were a moral failing, Narcissa replied firmly. Severus, you've spent 15 years serving men who view children as expendable resources. Haven't you had enough of being complicit in their schemes? Snape was quiet for a long moment, staring into his glass. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to help me build a network of adults who put children's welfare above political objectives. Parents, teachers, family members, anyone who has watched this war corrupt the young and felt sick about their inability to stop it. She stood and began pacing again, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. Think about it, Severus. How many people in the Order have expressed private doubts about using children as soldiers? How many Death Eaters have quietly questioned the wisdom of marking 17-year-old boys? How many teachers at Hogwarts have watched their students be put in danger and felt powerless to intervene? Many, Snape admitted. But doubt is not the same as action, and the consequences for acting against either side would be no worse than what will happen to our children if we continue to do nothing, Narcissa interrupted. Draco has been given a mission that will likely kill him. Harry Potter is being systematically prepared for suicide. How many more children must we watch be sacrificed before we admit that both sides are fundamentally wrong about what victory is worth? She stopped pacing and faced him directly. You told me earlier that you see Lily's sacrifice in my willingness to save Draco. But I've been thinking about that. About what Lily Potter actually did that night. She died to save her son, Snape said quietly. No, Narcissa said with sudden intensity. She refused to participate in her child's murder. When Voldemort demanded that she step aside and let him kill Harry, she said no. Not because she was particularly brave, not because she had some grand political vision, but because she was a mother who would not collaborate in the destruction of her own child. She moved closer to Snape's chair, her eyes blazing with conviction. That's what we're really talking about here, refusing to collaborate in the destruction of our children. Both sides want us to believe that such destruction is necessary, that there's no other choice, that good parents should willingly sacrifice their children for the greater good. But Lily Potter proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply saying no. Snape set down his glass and looked at her with something that might have been hope. And you think other parents might be ready to follow her example? I think other parents are desperate for an alternative to the choice between feeding their children to Dumbledore's cause or to Voldemort's, Narcissa replied. I think mothers like Molly Weasley lie awake at night, wondering if there might be some other way to protect the world their children inherit. I think fathers like Arthur Weasley have moments of doubt about whether the Order's methods are truly better than their enemies. She returned to the table and pulled a third piece of parchment toward her. Who else? What other families have children caught between these forces? The Longbottoms, Snape said slowly, understanding where her thoughts were leading. Neville's grandmother has raised him since his parents were tortured into madness. She's fiercely protective, but has also pushed him to live up to their legacy. Augusta Longbottom, Narcissa murmured, beginning to write. A woman who knows exactly what Voldemort's forces can do to families, but who might be persuaded that there are better ways to protect children than sending them to war. As she wrote, Snape continued, the Diggories. Cedric's parents are still grieving his death in the tournament. They blame Voldemort, but they might also question why Dumbledore allowed the tournament to proceed when he knew it was dangerous. Yes, Narcissa said, her writing becoming more rapid. Parents who have already paid the price of trusting powerful men with their children's safety. They understand the cost in ways that others might not. She looked up at Snape with growing excitement. What about within Hogwarts itself? Are there teachers who share your doubts? Professor McGonagall has always been uncomfortable with the risks Harry faces, Snape admitted. She's argued with Dumbledore privately about his methods, though she ultimately defers to his judgment. Professor Sprout has made similar objections about using students in dangerous situations. Then we have potential allies within the school as well, Narcissa said, making notes. Teachers who might be willing to prioritize student safety over institutional loyalty if they understood the full scope of what's been happening. She set down the quill and looked at her growing list of names and possibilities. The question is how to approach them without triggering suspicion from either side. Very carefully, Snape said dryly, and with the understanding that not everyone will be willing to risk everything for the sake of children who aren't their own. Then we start with the ones who are, Narcissa replied firmly. We build slowly, carefully, with people who have the most to lose, and therefore understand the stakes most clearly. She stood again, moving to the window where the storm had finally passed, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. I need to return home before Lucius notices I'm gone. But first, I want your honest assessment. Do you think this is possible? Do you think we can build something strong enough to challenge both sides? Snape was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think, he said finally, that you're proposing the only moral response to an immoral situation. Whether it's possible, he shrugged. That will depend on how many other people are as tired as we are of watching children pay for adult ambitions. Narcissa nodded, gathering the letters she had written. Then we'll find out. And Severus, whatever happens, know that tonight has changed everything for me. I came here looking for information about Dumbledore's character. I'm leaving with a mission to save both our children from the men who would sacrifice them. Where will you start? Snape asked. With Andromeda, Narcissa replied. If I can reach my sister, if I can bridge a gap that has lasted 25 years, then perhaps other seemingly impossible reconciliations are also achievable. She moved toward the door, then paused. The unbreakable vow still binds us both. We must still fulfill its terms, but perhaps we can fulfill them in ways that serve our purposes rather than theirs. A dangerous game, Snape warned. Everything worthwhile is dangerous, Narcissa replied. The question is whether we're willing to take risks to protect children, or whether we'll continue to let others take risks with children's lives. She opened the door to the now quiet street, then looked back one final time. Thank you, Severus, for showing me the truth, and for helping me understand that knowledge without action is just another form of complicity. For Lily, Snape said quietly, and for all the children who deserve better than the choices we've been given. For our children, Narcissa agreed, and for the possibility that love might yet prove stronger than any ideology that demands their sacrifice. She stepped into the night, leaving Snape alone with his thoughts and the empty vials that had contained 15 years of terrible memories. Outside, the storm had passed, but Narcissa Malfoy carried with her the seeds of a different kind of tempest, one that would challenge the fundamental assumptions of a war that had forgotten what it was supposed to protect. Chapter 11. The Gathering Storm. 3 days after her midnight conversation with Severus Snape, Narcissa Malfoy stood in the drawing room of Malfoy Manor, reading a letter that had arrived by an unmarked owl that morning. The parchment was worn and practical rather than elegant, the kind used by people who valued function over form. Mrs. Malfoy, your letter reached me through channels I will not name here. I find myself curious about your proposal, though I confess to considerable skepticism. We have been enemies too long for trust to come easily. That said, I am a mother first, and if you truly believe there is a path that might protect our children from the choices their fathers have made, I am willing to listen. There is a small tea shop in Diagon Alley called Flourish and Blot's Annex, above the bookstore. Tuesday afternoon, 3 o'clock. Come alone, and come prepared to prove that your concern for children extends beyond your own son. Weasley. Narcissa read the letter 3 times before vanishing it with a flick of her wand. Molly Weasley was exactly as shrewd as Severus had suggested, cautious enough to choose a public venue where neither side would expect a clandestine meeting, but isolated enough for frank conversation. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn toward the doorway, where Lucius appeared, looking haggard and older than his years. Prison had aged him, and the constant stress of their family's precarious position had deepened the lines around his eyes. "You seem restless lately," he observed, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose confidence had been systematically destroyed. "More correspondence than usual." "Family matters," Narcissa replied smoothly, a practiced deflection that had served her well throughout their marriage. "Bellatrix has been pressuring me to take a more active role in the Dark Lord's service, and I've been consulting with distant relatives about appropriate responses." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had been corresponding with family, specifically Andromeda, who had responded to her letter with cautious warmth and an invitation to meet. The years of estrangement had not erased their sisterly bond entirely, and Andromeda's perspective as a mother whose daughter worked as an aura provided valuable insight into the Order's internal dynamics. "Be careful," Lucius warned, his voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. "The Dark Lord's patience with our family grows thin. Any misstep now could be our last." Narcissa moved to stand behind his chair, placing her hands on his shoulders in a gesture of comfort that also allowed her to avoid meeting his eyes. "I understand the stakes, Lucius. Everything I do is calculated to protect our son." That at least was completely true. Tuesday afternoon found Narcissa in the narrow tea shop above Flourish and Blot's, nursing a cup of Earl Grey while she waited for Molly Weasley to arrive. The proprietor, an elderly witch with kind eyes, seemed to understand the need for privacy and had directed Narcissa to a corner table partly screened by hanging plants. When Molly entered, she looked exactly as Narcissa had expected. Practical robes, greying red hair pulled back efficiently, and the suspicious expression of a woman who had learned to expect the worst from pure-blood families. But beneath the wariness, Narcissa could see something else. The bone-deep exhaustion of a mother who had watched too many of her children march toward danger. "Mrs. Weasley," Narcissa rose to greet her. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," Molly replied bluntly, taking the seat across from her. 25 years of conflict doesn't disappear because of a single letter. "But something in your words." She paused, studying Narcissa's face. "You sounded like a mother who had reached her breaking point." "I have," Narcissa admitted, settling back into her chair. "May I speak plainly? I wouldn't have it any other way." Narcissa leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "How many of your children are actively involved in this war?" Molly's jaw tightened. "All of them, in one way or another. Bill works for Gringotts, but also for the Order. Charlie remains in Romania, but he's in contact with our efforts. Percy," her voice faltered slightly. "Percy works for the Ministry and has cut ties with the family, though I suspect that estrangement serves purposes beyond what it appears. The twins run their shop but also develop products for Order use. Ron is at Hogwarts with Harry Potter. Ginny is there as well." 7 children, Narcissa said quietly, all of them exposed to danger because of choices made by adults. "They fight because the cause is just," Molly replied, but there was something defensive in her tone. "Because someone must stand against Voldemort's darkness." And I don't dispute the necessity of opposing the Dark Lord, Narcissa said carefully. But I question whether the current approach is the only way to achieve that goal. Tell me, Mrs. Weasley, when you lie awake at night, worrying about your children, do you ever wonder if there might be strategies that don't require them to risk their lives repeatedly? Molly was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her teacup as if seeking warmth. Every night, she finally admitted. But what alternative is there? Dumbledore has more experience with these matters than any of us. If he says, this is how the war must be fought, then perhaps it's time to question Professor Dumbledore's judgment, Narcissa said gently. Not his intentions, which I'm sure are honorable, but his methods. Have you ever asked yourself why so many of the Order's strategies seem to require children to face mortal danger? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Molly's expression grew troubled, and Narcissa could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, loyalty to Dumbledore warring with maternal instinct. What exactly are you suggesting? Molly asked finally. I'm suggesting that there might be adults on both sides who are tired of watching children pay for political objectives, Narcissa replied. Parents who might be willing to work together to find solutions that prioritize our children's welfare over strategic advantage. She pulled a small piece of parchment from her robes and slid it across the table. These are names of other mothers who have expressed similar concerns. Not all of them are on your side of this conflict, but all of them are on the side of protecting children. Molly unfolded the parchment and read the names written there. Andromeda Tonks, Augusta Longbottom, Amelia Bones, whose niece was at Hogwarts, and several others, a mixture of pure blood, half-blood, and Muggle-born families united only by their shared concern for the next generation. Some of these women have lost children already, Molly observed, which means they understand the cost of our current path better than anyone, Narcissa replied. They know what we risk losing if we continue to treat children as acceptable casualties. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the tea shop owner, who quietly refilled their cups before retreating again. The brief pause gave both women a moment to consider what was being discussed. What would this cooperation look like? Molly asked finally. Our families are on opposite sides of a war. Our husbands and older relatives are on opposite sides, Narcissa corrected. But mothers share certain priorities that transcend political allegiances. We want our children to survive this war. We want them to grow up in a world worth inheriting, and we want them to reach adulthood with their souls intact. She met Molly's eyes directly. I know what the Dark Lord asks of young Death Eaters. I know the missions he gives to prove loyalty, the prices he demands for family protection. Do you know what Dumbledore asks of the children who follow him? Molly's silence was answer enough. Then perhaps it's time we both learned more about the costs our supposed allies are willing to pay with our children's lives, Narcissa suggested. Information shared in service of protection, not politics. As their meeting concluded an hour later, both women carried with them a new understanding and a growing network of contacts who shared their concerns. Narcissa had been careful not to reveal too much too quickly, but she had planted seeds that could grow into something larger. Meanwhile, at Hogwarts, Severus Snape was conducting his own careful inquiries. As both a professor and a member of the Order, he had access to conversations and planning sessions that revealed the full scope of how children were being deployed in the war effort. The information he gathered was disturbing. Plans were already in motion to involve students more directly in intelligence gathering. Harry Potter was being prepared for increasingly dangerous missions, and Draco Malfoy's assassination attempt was being allowed to proceed with minimal interference, ostensibly to gather information about Voldemort's methods. But what troubled Snape most were the casual conversations he overheard among Order members, discussions that treated teenage casualties as regrettable but inevitable, strategic decisions that prioritized information gathering over student safety, and an overall acceptance that children would necessarily bear much of the burden in the coming conflict. It was exactly what Narcissa had predicted, both sides viewing young lives as currency to be spent in pursuit of larger goals. That evening, as Snape graded essays in his office, he received an unexpected visitor. Professor McGonagall stood in his doorway, her expression troubled. "Severus, may I speak with you privately?" "Of course, Minerva. What concerns you?" She entered and closed the door behind her, then cast a silencing charm with practiced efficiency. "I've been observing the students since term began, particularly those with complicated family situations. You're referring to young Malfoy, I assume?" "Among others," McGonagall confirmed. "The boy looks ill, Severus, thin, pale, jumping at shadows. When I try to speak with him about his coursework, he seems terrified that I might discover something." "The stresses of war affect us all differently," Snape replied carefully. "This is more than stress," McGonagall said firmly. "This is a child carrying a burden no 17-year-old should bear. And when I brought my concerns to Albus—" She paused, her lips tightening. "He assured me that Draco's situation was being handled appropriately, and that intervention would be counterproductive to larger objectives." The phrase hung in the air like an indictment. McGonagall had clearly reached some of the same conclusions that were driving Narcissa's resistance movement. "What are you asking me, Minerva?" "I'm asking if you think there might be ways to help our students that don't require approval from the headmaster," she said quietly. "I'm asking if you believe there are times when a teacher's duty to their students supersedes institutional loyalty." Snape studied her face carefully. McGonagall was as close to Dumbledore as anyone, had been his deputy for decades. If she was beginning to question his methods, that would be a very dangerous path, he said finally. "More dangerous than watching children destroy themselves while we do nothing?" McGonagall countered. "Severus, I've been teaching for 40 years. I've seen students face dark wizards, deadly creatures, and impossible challenges, but I've never seen anything like what we're asking of them now." She moved closer to his desk, her voice dropping even further. "There are other teachers who share these concerns. Professor Sprout mentioned that Hannah Abbott's aunt has been asking pointed questions about Hogwarts' safety protocols. Professor Flitwick has noted changes in students whose families are involved in the conflict. We're all seeing the same patterns, but we're all afraid to speak openly about them. And what do you propose to do about these concerns?" "I propose that we remember our primary obligation is to the children in our care," McGonagall said firmly. "Whatever else happens, whatever larger purposes we're meant to serve, our first duty is to protect the students who trust us with their welfare." As McGonagall left his office, Snape realized that Narcissa's instincts had been correct. The resistance she was building wouldn't be limited to parents. It would include teachers, relatives, family friends, and anyone else who had reached their limit with watching children be sacrificed for adult ambitions. But he also realized something else. Both Dumbledore and Voldemort were beginning to notice the changing attitudes among their followers. The war was entering a new phase, one where the question wouldn't just be which side would win, but whether either side would be allowed to continue treating children as expendable resources in their conflict. The gathering storm Narcissa had set in motion was about to test everyone's true priorities. Chapter 12. The Memory's End. 2 weeks after her first meeting with Molly Weasley, Narcissa returned to Spinner's End as the sun was setting over the industrial landscape of Cokeworth. The network she and Severus had begun building was growing faster than either of them had expected. But with that growth came increased scrutiny from both sides of the conflict. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, as Snape let her into his cramped sitting room. "Both Dumbledore and the Dark Lord are asking questions." Snape nodded grimly, moving toward the room with even more care than usual. "Dumbledore summoned me to his office yesterday. He wanted to discuss what he called concerning shifts in attitude among Order families." "And Voldemort?" "Has noticed that several Death Eater families seem less enthusiastic about their children's involvement in his service. Snape settled into his chair, looking older and more tired than she had ever seen him. He's particularly interested in why Augusta Longbottom has been asking pointed questions about Neville's safety at Hogwarts. Narcissa took her usual seat across from him, but this time there was no hesitation in her manner, no uncertainty about what they were attempting. 2 weeks of careful alliance building had crystallized her resolve into something unshakable. "There's one more memory I need to show you," Snape said quietly. "One I recorded just yesterday. It will explain why our timeline has suddenly become much shorter than we hoped." He retrieved a fresh vial from his cabinet, the memory still swirling with silver light. As he poured it into the pensieve, Narcissa could see his hands were trembling slightly. "What is it?" she asked. "Dumbledore's final instructions regarding Harry Potter," Snape replied, and his response when I asked if there was any other way. The memory pulled her in, and suddenly she was standing in Dumbledore's office as the headmaster sat behind his desk. But this Dumbledore was clearly dying. His blackened hand was worse than ever, his breathing labored, his skin waxy and pale. He looked like a man who had only weeks left to live. "The time has come, Severus," Dumbledore was saying, his voice still gentle despite his obvious pain. "Harry must be told about the Horcrux, about what he must do." "When?" Snape's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Soon. This year, certainly. My own time grows short, and Harry must be prepared to face his destiny while I can still guide him toward the correct choice." "And if he refuses?" Snape asked. "If he chooses to live rather than die for your greater good?" Dumbledore's expression grew infinitely sad, but also implacable. "Then we will make it clear to him that his continued existence dooms everyone he cares about. Hermione Granger, Ron Weasley, Ginny Weasley, Neville Longbottom. All of them will die because he was too selfish to make the necessary sacrifice. You would threaten his friends to force him into suicide. I prefer to think of it as ensuring he has all the relevant information," Dumbledore replied calmly. "Harry has always been most motivated by the desire to protect others. We will simply make it clear that protecting others requires his death." Snape was silent for a long moment. Then, "And afterward? When Harry is dead and Voldemort can be defeated, what happens to the children who survive this war? They will grow up in a world freed from darkness," Dumbledore said with satisfaction. "A world where their sacrifice, and Harry's, will have meaning. A world where adults learn that children are acceptable losses for political objectives," Snape corrected bitterly. "A world where the next crisis will also be solved by sacrificing the young for the benefit of their elders." For the first time, Dumbledore showed a flicker of irritation. "Severus, your sentimentality regarding the children is understandable but misguided. Some prices must be paid. Some sacrifices must be made. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we can move forward with what must be done." "And what if I refuse?" Snape asked quietly. "What if I decide that no cause is worth the deliberate murder of children?" Dumbledore's expression became very still, very cold. "Then you would be betraying everything Lily Potter died for. You would be choosing sentiment over duty, selfishness over service. You would be proving yourself unworthy of the trust she placed in your ability to protect her son." "By helping you kill him?" "By helping him fulfill his destiny," Dumbledore corrected. "By ensuring that Lily's sacrifice was not in vain." The memory ended, leaving Narcissa back in Snape's sitting room, her heart pounding with fury. But this time, the rage was cold, controlled, sharpened into something that could cut through any obstacle. "He's accelerating his timeline," she said quietly. "The curse is killing him faster than expected," Snape confirmed. "He wants to ensure Harry is properly prepared before his own death removes Dumbledore's guiding influence. Which means we have only months to save both boys." Narcissa stood and began pacing, But this wasn't the nervous energy of earlier weeks. This was the focused movement of someone planning a campaign. The unbreakable vow, she said suddenly. We need to honor its terms while subverting its purpose. Explain. You vowed to protect Draco and to kill Dumbledore if necessary. I vowed to help my son complete his mission and to take over if he failed. She turned to face Snape directly. What if we interpret those vows in ways that serve our purposes rather than theirs? Snape's eyebrows rose. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we fulfill the letter of our vows while completely undermining their spirit. Narcissa's voice grew stronger as the plan took shape in her mind. You will indeed kill Dumbledore, but on our terms, in a way that serves our larger purpose of protecting children rather than perpetuating their sacrifice. And Draco's mission will be completed, but not in the way anyone expects. She moved closer to Snape's chair, her eyes blazing with determination. What if Draco's assassination of Dumbledore becomes something else entirely? What if it becomes the moment when we expose the truth about what both sides have been doing to the children in their care? Snape studied her face carefully. You're talking about using Dumbledore's death as a catalyst for something larger. I'm talking about ensuring that when Dumbledore dies, whether from the curse, from Draco's hand, or from yours, his death serves to protect children rather than to further endanger them. Narcissa's voice grew fierce with conviction. The man has spent years manipulating Harry Potter into accepting suicide as noble. What if his own death became a lesson about the cost of treating children as expendable? The Dark Lord would still expect his mission completed, and it will be. But perhaps by then, enough parents will have awakened to what's really happening, that Voldemort's power over families will begin to crumble. She returned to her chair, leaning forward with intense focus. Severus, we're not just trying to save 2 boys. We're trying to change the fundamental assumptions that allowed this situation to develop in the first place. Snape was quiet for a long moment, considering. It would be extraordinarily dangerous. The risks to both of us, to our families, would be no greater than the certainty of what happens if we do nothing, Narcissa replied firmly. Harry Potter dies believing it's noble. Draco dies believing he failed. And the next generation learns that children exist to serve adult ambitions. She stood again, moving to the window where this entire journey had begun weeks earlier. I came here looking for information about Dumbledore's character. I leave knowing that character is irrelevant. What matters is what he's been willing to do to children in service of his goals. And Voldemort has proven himself equally willing to sacrifice children for his objectives. She turned back to Snape. Which means we're not choosing between good and evil. We're choosing between 2 different versions of evil that both treat children as expendable. Or we choose to reject both versions in favor of something that actually protects the innocent, Snape said slowly, understanding dawning in his dark eyes. Exactly. Narcissa returned to her chair one final time. I need you to make me a promise, Severus. Not an unbreakable vow, but something more important. A promise between 2 people who have decided that love is more important than loyalty. What promise? That whatever happens in the coming months, whatever choices we have to make, whatever prices we have to pay, we will not sacrifice children for adult objectives. Not Harry, not Draco, not any of them. Snape met her gaze steadily. I promise, and I ask the same promise from you. You have it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their commitment settling between them like an anchor. Outside, night was falling over Cokeworth, but inside Snape's modest sitting room, 2 adults had quietly declared war on the assumption that children's lives were currency to be spent in pursuit of larger goals. I should return home, Narcissa said finally. Lucius will be wondering about my absence, and I need to prepare for what comes next." She stood, but paused at the doorway. "The vial of memories. Keep it safe. When the time comes to show other parents what we've learned, they'll need to see the truth for themselves." "Where will you start?" Snape asked. "With Draco," she replied. "My son needs to understand that he's not alone, that there are adults working to protect him rather than use him. And after that—" "After that?" Narcissa smiled, and for the first time in weeks it reached her eyes. "After that, we teach powerful men what happens when mothers decide their children are more important than political objectives." She stepped into the night, leaving Snape alone with his thoughts and the empty pensieve that had contained 15 years of terrible truths. But as she walked through the dark streets toward her apparition point, Narcissa Malfoy carried with her something more powerful than any memory: the absolute conviction that love for children could triumph over any ideology that demanded their sacrifice. Tomorrow, she would begin the most important work of her life. Tonight, she was content, knowing that she was no longer complicit in the destruction of innocence. The war would continue, but it would no longer be fought with children's lives as its primary currency. Not if she had anything to say about it. And Narcissa Malfoy, who had spent years learning to navigate the dangerous waters of pure-blood politics, intended to have a great deal to say about it indeed.